as we get ready to get started today, thank you all for being here. Let me say that this could go a little while. We have water and even some snacks up front if at any point in time you feel like you would like something. I encourage you to come up and take part. The first item on the agenda today, the State Funding Board meeting, is consideration and approval of the minutes from the State Funding Board meeting we held on October 9th, 2023. Members, I hope you have had time to review those minutes in the packet you were provided before the meeting. And unless there's any questions or discussion, I'd appreciate a motion for adoption of the minutes.
Second.
Have a motion properly seconded for adoption of the minutes. Again, any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes as presented for the October 9th, 2023 meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, like sign? The item is approved. Next on our agenda today is a report from the Department of Economic and Community Development for consideration and approval of funding of some fast track projects. It looks like 2 projects on the list today. And members, unless there's any objection, I'll recommend that ECD present both of these projects for consideration at once. Seeing no objection, Commissioner, I'll recognize you and your team to present both the projects we have on the list today for consideration all at once.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You're right.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So just talk. Is that it? This is working. Nice.
So our presenters are using tabletop microphones today, and you can just talk and you will be heard.
Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Can y'all do this without Paul Bell?
I'm sorry.
Do this without Paul Bell?
Well,
Maybe not.
we're going to give it a whirl.
I'm Paul.
Did y'all recognize Paul?
You're an upgrade, Jessica.
Yeah.
The Tennessee Regulatory Authority.
Yes, sir. I'm real prepared.
Yes, and I that was my opening remarks was to say that we're very fortunate to have Jessica Johnson stepping up and as assistant commissioner, and she's been trained well by Paul, and our beloved Paul Vandermeer retired, and so this is the first without him here. So we're very glad of his service and his contributions to our department, that's for sure, and to the state of Tennessee. And I think you all know Alan Borden. So we will start it off, and Jessica, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. So we'll start with the balance as of the previous meeting. It's $678.1 million. Since then, we've had a new appropriation of $12,400, which is comprised of a global adjustment for technology and computer-related expenses. We have a newly deobligated funds of $3.9 million. The fast track grants approved less than $750,000, total $992,000. The fast track administration amount is $1.3 million, which brings us to an adjusted fast track balance available of $679.8 million. Our total amount committed is $558.1 million, with an uncommitted fast track balance of $121.7 million, bringing us to a percentage committed of 82.1%. With today's request of $8.7 million, the balance of the fund would be $113 million for a percentage committed of 83.4%.
Any questions on the balances?
Members, any questions on the balances? No, please proceed.
Great, thank you. As stated, 2 projects that we have to present today. The first is the Malibu Boats LLC and Cobalt Boats LLC, Lenoir City and Roane County. Malibu Boats is one of the largest employers in East Tennessee. The company designs and engineers, manufactures, markets, and sells recreational power boats globally. The Lenoir City location is the company's second plant outside of its headquarters in Loudon, Tennessee, and will allow the company to expand production and manufacturing capabilities of Cobalt boats, which is a great boat, by the way, to better meet its growing global customer demands. Malibu Boats LLC is committed to create 770 net new jobs and make a $75 million capital investment within 5 years. The company will have an average hourly wage of $21.17. Just want to note that when this was presented to us at that time, the county median wage was right at that $21.17. But as of today, the county has done well economically, and their county median wage today is at $22.19. So it's a little bit below the median wage, but 770 jobs in that county and that kind of capital commitment, we feel very strongly is a really good deal and partnership. The Fast Track Job Economic Development Grant Fund will help offset expenses such as acquisition of real property and new building, and the request is for $7.7 million of fast track funds. The second project is August Bioservices in Nashville, Davidson County. Headquartered in Nashville, August Bioservices is a contract development and manufacturing organization providing drug discovery, drug development, and drug manufacturing services in support of the global pharmaceutical industry. So as you may all recall, back in November of 2020, August Bioservices announced the commitment to create 181 net new jobs and make just over a $64 million capital investment within 5 years. That was their phase one. Now they've come back. Phase two is they've committed to create an additional 90 net new jobs. So the total jobs for August between the phase one and phase two is 271 jobs. And they'll make an additional $65 million capital investment for a total of $129 million capital investment within 5 years. So their phase one was approved. The fast track request at that time was $2 million, and that was approved. This phase two is for $1 million. The request to increase the existing commitment in the form of a fast track job economic development grant of $1 million. So the request is for $1 million. So those are the two projects. The county median wage the wage on this one is $52.13 compared to the county median wage of $22.52. So those are the two projects.
Very good. Members, you've heard the two projects presented. Do we have a motion?
I'll move.
Have a motion. Do we have a second? Have a motion properly seconded forward with the two projects as described. Commissioner, I will ask you as usual, in regard to these two projects, have the companies signed the incentive acceptance forms, and do they fully understand the agreements?
They have, yes.
And have the checklist been completed for each project?
Yes, sir, they have.
And do all of the projects you described today include accountability agreements which provide protections to the state in the event the entities cannot hold up their end of the deal?
They do.
Thank you very much. Members, any further questions or comments today? Certainly two exciting projects. All those in favor of approving the projects as described, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, like sign. The items are approved.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sir.
I'm going to quickly, if I can, call an audible, Sandy, and ask if we can move to item number 8 on the agenda. Could we do that, which is consideration and approval of a declaration of trust for other post-employment benefits for West Knox Utility District? We able to do that?
Yes.
I want to do that in the event we go long and run into a quorum issue later today, as I think that is another action item we need to address. So we're going to, again, for those in the room, for those watching online, move to item number 8 on the agenda, consideration and approval of a declaration of trust for other post-employment benefits for West Knox County Utility District. Sandy Thompson, you're going to present on that one. You're recognized.
It's on, isn't it? Okay, it is on. Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, State Funding Board members. We were presented with this declaration of trust for an OPEB trust for the West Knox Utility District just recently. And we did submit it to the AG's office for their review. And we reviewed it for all the criteria that's required under Tennessee law. And it's met all the criteria. And so staff is recommending this trust for approval.
Move to approve.
Thank you very much. We have a motion for approval, properly seconded. Any questions or discussion? If not, all those in favor of the item, please respond by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, like sign. The item is approved. Thank you very much. I will note as well, in regard to meeting our statutory responsibilities for public comment, Sandy, you received no request for public comment for this meeting. Is that correct?
There were no requests received.
So there were no requests received according to the guidelines we have adopted, and therefore no public comment today. Thank you very much. So here is what we are all here for. Here is what we have all been waiting on today, our annual revenue estimating procedures and presentations. We thank you all for being here today. We're especially grateful for the presenters we have today that are going to talk about their view of the current economic situation in the state and give us their best thoughts and advice as we look to, here in a couple weeks, issue revenue estimates for next year's budget. First up today, Laurel Grafey, who is back with us, gratefully. Laurel Grafey, the Regional Executive for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the Nashville branch. Always bring us a great presentation. We appreciate you being back with us, and you're recognized.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to join once again this year and look forward to giving a bit of an update from the discussion we had last year. I figured I would again touch on the three main areas that we discussed last year, but share a bit about how my thinking has shifted and how the information we're getting on the ground really has evolved quite a bit in the past year. To start, I think I and anyone else at the Federal Reserve has eyes laser focused on inflation today, just as much as we had a year ago. And I'm relieved to share that inflation pressures are moderating considerably. A year ago, both businesses and households listed inflation as, if not the single greatest challenge they were facing, among the top two. That has significantly dissipated. So folks are feeling a lot more confident about their spending power. National data around inflation suggests things are moving in the right direction, although what we consider price stability, which is 2% annual inflation, is still quite a bit of ways from where we are, which is of course part of the driving reason why the Federal Reserve has so far increased interest rates by 5.25 percentage points since the beginning of last year. I think one thing I want to draw attention to, because of course we balance backward-looking data measuring things like what inflation was in the past with both conversations and survey metrics of what folks who are actually setting prices are saying they plan to do in the future. And so this next picture demonstrates survey respondents. This is a cross-section of firm sizes, industries, geographies across the country. What folks, so the upper line, the blue line, is what their average price change was over the previous 12 months. And the green line, the lower line, represents what they expect to do going forward. So I'm relieved to share that number continues to come down. It is not yet sort of fully back to where we were at a quote unquote typical time pre-pandemic, but we're really moving in a good direction. And certainly this is being reinforced by conversations out in the field that we're having with business leaders saying they're really starting to get pushback from consumers. Folks are no longer accepting price increases without question. Consumers are looking for value. In many cases, they're finding opportunities to quote unquote trade down and search for lower cost, whether it's the lower cost retailers or lower cost brands within the retailers. So that certainly is starting to play a role in how firms are thinking about their movements in prices over the coming year. And that connects to labor markets in a really big way. We've talked before about how inflation in this country for a very long time has been driven by services inflation, whereas goods prices actually historically are flat or even slightly declining year over year. So that, of course, turned on its head during the pandemic as we saw, folks were stuck at home and demand for goods spiked. And we had all the supply chain issues push up goods inflation. That has now, I would say, if not fully, it has almost fully rebalanced. And that's showing up in the data. It is also very apparent in conversations with firms who are describing, if you are in the goods business, you are now once again really having to compete very heavily for your market share. There is pressure from consumers to resume things like seasonal discounting, special holiday promotions, that kind of thing that retailers had been able to let go of a little bit over the past couple of years. That is expected to fully resume and be once again the way that kind of shoppers drive their behavior going forward. And of course, we know on the services front, that is where we've been seeing the greatest portion of inflation pressure to date. And if you are in the services business, we know that very likely your greatest cost is people, is labor markets. And so it's part of why we have, as my team and I have been trying to wrap our minds around where inflation is today, and importantly, where it's going in the future. One of the things we're paying the closest attention to is not just expectations for inflation, but how our firms and how our workers actually planning for wage increases going forward. And certainly overall, this chart was not updated with last week's labor market report, but we certainly know the labor market remains strong. It added, again, the number that's not in here is 150,000 jobs on net across the country in the past month. We actually still consider that to be quite strong. That is above the level that we consider to be roughly neutral. So it takes about 75,000 jobs a month to essentially put no pressure upward or downward on the unemployment rate and just kind of absorb new folks as they become working age. We are continuing to see a job market that is adding jobs and putting more and more pressure on the market out there. And that's certainly showing up in the data. In the next slide, this is a little bit less pronounced, so I'm not going to focus on it today, but we also know that some of the driver of the strength in the labor market has actually been some unusual things happening in the sectoral space. So the strength has not been spread across the labor market evenly. But in fact, just one sector, which makes up 13 or 14% of our total employment, has actually been the overwhelming driver of job growth over the past couple of years, and that's healthcare and social assistance. And of course, we know there are issues around both job losses that took place in that sector during the pandemic, and also just some sectoral changes around an aging population and a growing needs for jobs in that space that lead me to, in some ways, look twice at interpreting the overall headline job growth numbers as necessarily implying continued optimism and pressure from employers that they're growing to support, say, a big boost in future demand. And instead, it looks like what folks are doing is backfilling roles that they hadn't been able to fill over the past couple of years. And this fits with what we've been hearing anecdotally, where job applicants are greater, folks are more willing to show up to the first day of work, turnover is lower. A lot of these areas of pressure that firms really had been struggling with over the past several years seems to have, they certainly have not gone away, but have abated to a very large extent, which I see as very good news when it comes to what are we going to see on the wage front, and are firms really going to be able to staff up sufficiently to do the work that we all know we need them to do. I'll skip forward one or two slides to labor force participation. We've touched on this in the past, but wanted to give an update. Of course, overall, as a country, our labor force participation rate is still a little bit lower than it was before the pandemic. It has been on a kind of downward decline for decades now, and that trend certainly continues. However, I think something of note and of significance is for workers between 25 and 54 years of age, which is by far our greatest portion of our workforce, we are actually seeing higher labor force participation than we did pre-pandemic. It has now exceeded the rate that was typical pre-pandemic. And some of this, I think, has come as quite a surprise to many economists looking at this data even a year or a year and a half ago, that folks have continued to, and even just in the past few months, there seems to have been a really notable inflow of workers into the workforce who had previously been on the sidelines, which is very good news. We continue to face some of the challenges around an aging population, where we just have folks who have worked in the past and have the skills to work are opting into retirement in a way that is kind of more like what we were used to before the financial crisis, and we're not seeing those same really strong rates of labor force participation that we had gotten so accustomed to following, say, the 2009, 2010 period. This, of course, is playing into a wage story. We're paying really close attention to what employers are saying they plan to do with wages, what workers are saying they plan to demand from their employers in terms of wages. So what I've done here is map on top of each other a calculation that we do at the Atlanta Fed around wage growth tracker. So this kind of removes any wage growth that happens when people swap careers or swap jobs. And so we're trying to hold constant what's actually the core wage growth, aside from any kind of cyclical things that might be happening around people changing jobs. So the pace of wage growth captured by that is this blue line, and the red line is inflation. And I think this really gets to so much of the heart of how folks across the country were struggling over the past couple of years, where we saw employers say, we are having to jump, we are giving larger wage increases than in many cases we ever have. We're giving unbudgeted wage increases. We're having to give them mid-year. I mean, firms were really doing what they could to recognize their workers and to support them. And at the same time, inflation was rising at a significantly higher clip than wages. So despite the increase in the dollars that were written on your paycheck, for a large majority of Americans that rely on paychecks to support their households, their actual spending power was going down. That fortunately has reversed. So we are now in a period where the blue line, the wage growth, is actually above the current rate of inflation. And I think I will continue to make a case today, or at least try to communicate what I've been hearing, which is this particular switch, this new switch where we're seeing wage growth above inflation, seems to be an incredibly important driver of what we're seeing on the consumer spending front and on the consumer confidence front. Before I switch over to that, just quickly, I always find it helpful to kind of ground my thinking in, of course, what firms are saying about their businesses rather than what economists are saying about their businesses. This is another survey we do of kind of businesses across sizes across the country, asking them, what is the greatest source of uncertainty that's impacting your decision making? And this is a really big shift. In fact, labor availability had been up there for a very long time, well before the pandemic. Labor availability tends to be one of the higher impacts. Inflation has come down considerably, and now folks are talking more broadly about economic activity, about the impact of interest rates, about these kind of broader macro events that are impacting the economy overall. And so with that, I'll just touch a bit on what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and certainly what the data is saying around the consumer spending side of things. When I joined you this time last year, I'm sure we talked about it in this meeting, and it was, I think, the very first word out of folks' mouths when I would be out and about meeting with employers across the state. Are we in a recession? Are we going in a recession? There was so much talk about that. And it's been really striking how that conversation has shifted. And so many employers and businesses had talked about plans for demand to slow down, plans for consumer spending to slow. And those things have happened. But for the most part, it's actually taken a lot longer than most firms had described or had forecasted. And it seems to have been a lot more gradual. And so certainly, firms are feeling the squeeze of interest rates. I mean, that is where households are feeling that. I mean, the interest rates are reverberating throughout the economy. We are seeing them starting to weigh, especially on some of these areas like that are very interest rate dependent. So things like the housing market, commercial real estate market, certainly bonds and areas where folks need to rely on banking services to support investment. I mean, we are feeling that, but it actually has had less of an impact, or at least a much slower impact on consumer behavior than I think most had predicted at the beginning of this tightening cycle. And this is an area where I have some slides, but I actually think a lot of the story is something that isn't showing up in the data right now. And it's been a pretty striking dichotomy where the data that has been coming in over the past several months has been pretty uniformly strong. There's been a lot of upside surprises, whether it's consumer spending, gross domestic product, kind of many of these indicators of overall activity across the economy have actually been kind of particularly robust, so robust that it has caused a lot of pundits to then question, hold on a second, is inflation about to start picking back up? Is this economy, did we completely skip a recession? Are we picking back up into a faster gear? That narrative goes against almost uniformly what I'm hearing from businesses and what my peers are hearing from businesses in our work at the Fed, that it's actually quite unusual for us to get a consistent story across industries, across firm sizes. There are, of course, exceptions. If you come anywhere near, say, electric vehicle investment, if you come anywhere near Music City tourism, there are certain areas where demand just continues to be extraordinarily strong. But for the most part, firms across the economy are describing something that looks like a slowing of activity. In some sectors, they describe it as it's a recession, as actual levels are declining. In most others, it's the pace of growth is slowing and the levels of demand actually remain kind of record high relative to what was typical pre-pandemic. So there's a bit of a normalization from this really, really strong demand growth that had become normal over the past couple of years due to a number of factors related to the pandemic. The next slide is a picture of personal consumption spending, or just consumer spending. It's to call out, yes, there is some rebalancing. We certainly know when the economy opened back up, there was a bunch of rebound spending on services. However, the level of goods spending in this economy has really held up, I would say, remarkably well relative to what was typical pre-pandemic. I would say, again, the little percentages are the proportion of overall consumer spending made up by these categories. So certainly services still overwhelmingly make up the largest proportion of consumer spending. And it's continuing to recover, but it is still not outpacing pre-pandemic norms the way that we are seeing in the goods space. And asking businesses about their own expectations. Again, this is I tend to rely on what business leaders say they're actually going to do instead of what my models say business leaders are going to do. And this is another question about, okay, as you look the year ahead, what's your expectation for adding staff to your payrolls, and what's your expectation for your revenue growth? And certainly expectations are for some slowing relative to what we've seen over the past year, although both are still actually holding up at quite strong levels. I think the one area that I would point out that's different, notably from when we had this conversation last year, is we are now hearing from employers in this survey that they expect to add fewer as a proportion of their workforce to grow their employment at a slower pace. I think part of that, anecdotally, is just firms had been so eager to staff up when they could not. And now, even as demand is slowing, many are saying, look, if we found great workers, we are doing everything we can to keep them on our payrolls, even as demand slows, because we feel so scarred from the experience of not being able to find, train, secure, retain the workforce that we need to do the work for the future. So my interpretation of the red line is a little bit different today than it would be in another time based on those conversations. And then I'll go to slide 18, just to call out, we talked about this last year. I don't think I had a picture for it yet. This is a picture of personal savings. And so the gray bar represents the recession associated with the early stage of the pandemic. And of course, we saw as folks received payments from the fiscal authorities as they were limited in their ability to spend, as they received additional supplemental unemployment benefits and whatnot, there was a huge spike in personal savings. And that has been drawn down consistently over time. So our current estimates is that wore out this summer, or at least is wearing out now, depending on kind of exactly whose estimates you're looking at. So we're now at a point where this exceptional boom in consumer spending that the economy had been benefiting from over the past couple of years, the source of that is no longer going to be able to be relying upon this big pot of excess savings that we were seeing on consumer balance sheets in the past. Again, I think a big upside, and something that I continue to hear from businesses who are really clued into their customers, is folks still are saying they feel quite secure in their job, quite secure in their ability to find a new job if they end up being displaced, quite secure in their current wage earnings. So there is a different factor. Seems to be a little bit of a different psyche driving consumer planning and consumer spending, especially on the kind of middle income and below segment of consumers, which typically, as you start to see demands cool off a bit, that's of course the first segment of our population that tends to pull back the hardest. Yeah, and I'll just close out to nod, because I know there's a lot of discussion about this. Slide 20 is the proportion of loans by each type that are 90 or more days delinquent. I mean, there certainly has been a lot of discussion about rising delinquencies in loans, and that is true. However, it doesn't look like we are at levels that are surpassing what was typical pre-pandemic in the vast majority of cases. The next picture, 21, shows how those delinquencies have increased, and that's certainly been the case since, say, early last year. We've continued to see delinquencies rise, but we are not yet to a point that in any historical period has been considered kind of a broader systemic risk or some issue that could end up bleeding into other demand across the economy. So something that my team and I are certainly paying a lot of attention to as we look to the source of consumer, how will consumers fuel and support their spending going forward. But again, returning to 2019 levels, which kind of almost all economists considered to be an extraordinarily strong year in this economy, isn't yet raising flags suggesting that consumers are feeling sort of historically squeezed in terms of their balance sheets. And then lastly, just a nod on the banking system. I know this is something getting a lot of attention right now, especially with rising interest rates and conversations about issues like office and commercial real estate coming due for refinancing. I mean, it's certainly something that we are paying close attention to. There seem to definitely be kind of segments and institutions that are feeling some disruption from that, but for the most part, are feeling confident that the industry is sound enough to be able to weather, and sequenced enough to be able to weather what's coming due in the coming years. And that is the conclusion of my prepared remarks. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller.
Thank you very much, as usual, for being here. There's so much in here that is so valuable, and we could explore much more in depth each slide. Members, as we get into questions and comments, let me start by asking you back on slide 13, which is observation 3. Curiosity from me, really. You say, though data in hand shows demand growing, or shows demand growth remaining stubbornly high, businesses describe consumer demand as softening. And is that specific to Tennessee or your area? Is that based on businesses you talk to in your district, so to speak, or is that nationwide data?
That reflects conversations I have had in my district in Tennessee, and seems to also be replicated across the country.
Thank you. And would you say, again, is your presentation built primarily on what you see in your district, which includes the state of Tennessee?
Yes, there is. I am I think I am exclusively presenting national data. This is a case when I want to be sure where everything I am hearing in Tennessee reflects this national story.
Very interesting. Very much. Members, how about questions? Yeah. No, not right now. So let me ask you this. Unlike our other presenters, you do not provide us a recommended range of revenue growth. But you're a Tennessean and well-informed Tennessean at that. So without necessarily providing a growth range, as the other presenters will do, if you were to give a behest to this board, what would you say? Would you say, or I don't want to put words, what would you say to us as we prepare to project revenue growth?
Thank you for that cover. And I am professionally an all-star at dodging questions, but I will take off my professional hat and speak as a neighbor and a Tennessean.
Yeah.
I see an economy that is slowing across the country, and I personally am not seeing conditions that give me the sense Tennessee will be excluded from that. However, we continue to be very uniquely and positively positioned, both in terms of immigration into the state, to be really benefiting from that. And also, I think stand out as, I'm going to have to check my numbers, one of the top few 2 or 3 states in the country that are receiving really significant benefits around investment in electric vehicles and electrification technology. That is beginning to play a very big role here. And I think in some ways it's both putting strain on areas with limited workforce and on inflation pressures and all of those sorts of things. But I think to some extent is insulating us from sort of the full force of what I might imagine could be felt nationally around the slowing of economic conditions.
What do you think? I think we're still in the short term as the life relates to this, but the impact of the war conflict in Israel and Ukraine, what effect does that have on the United States and to the extent you can, Tennessee specifically in the not too distant future?
Gosh, certainly the primary and most important effect is effect on human life and safety. From an economic perspective, these sorts of events can be kind of unusual in that big conflicts, big natural disasters, activities that involve a necessary large influx of activity or spending tend to actually be a boost to GDP, to the economy in the near term. So insofar as there are defense contractors or as households are investing in equipment to help them feel more secure at home, I mean, that type of activity tends to look positive to the economy in the near term, but can mask longer term costs of folks worrying about geopolitical instability, economic instability. Are things like that changing the way that folks think about global commerce, the way that folks think about investing in Tennessee, whether it's international counterparts being more hesitant to invest here, domestic counterparts feeling more secure about investing here because of geopolitical uncertainty. I think there is a lot of unknown about exactly how those impacts will play out, but it tends to be that spending our resources on conflict can sometimes divert those resources from investing in areas that help support economic vitality and productivity over the long term.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Is this on?
Yes, lean into it. Lean into it. It's on.
All right, thank you. So just listening to you and you were just describing the guns versus butter kind of kind of issue. But when I was thinking, I was looking at this and thinking about the extraordinary period we've just been through, where there have been a lot of steep declines, a lot of steep increase, rebounds, that type of thing. Is it fair to say that we're in or moving to a more normal cycle than we've been in over the past few years? I'm just as I look at your data, I expected it in some ways to be worse than it is, honestly, and it's not as in some places. And I'm just kind of curious how you would describe that. Are we moving into a more normal cycle?
We have a lot of arguments. I think I get pencils thrown at me when I use the word normal in my office with my team and speaking with businesses. I do think we are exiting a period where it almost felt like all bets were off during the pandemic. The economy was being driven by factors that were just so unlike anything we've ever experienced in modern U.S. economy, certainly modern Tennessee economy. So in that way, it feels like we're moving into a more normal period in that households and businesses seem to be talking about, being worried about, being focused on the same sorts of things that mattered to them historically. We're getting back to the kind of bread and butter of how do I run my business? How do I make my household finances work? In that way, it feels more comfortable to me as an economist to say, okay, I think I have a better sense of what might be impacting behavior. When I ask firms about normal, I almost consistently am pushed back that, yes, maybe this is normalizing. Maybe we're reaching a new point of stability, but normal is never going to look like 2019 again. The way workers think about their relationship with their employers, their relationship with place, the sorts of homes people demand. There are just the size of families that we're creating in this country. There are just some things that changed that it doesn't appear that behavior is or that firms are preparing for behavior to revert back to, like, I'm not going to walk into a store and carry a big bag of dog food out anymore. I've learned a beautiful way of someone else carrying it right to my door. I think there are ways that we have transformed that transformation will continue, but normalizing in the sense that we're getting back to regular economic factors driving decision making versus things that had to do with a global pandemic and the various public sector responses to that. Thank you.
Very good. Members, any further questions or comments? No? Thank you very much, as usual, for presenting to us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next up today, we have Dr. Dawn Bruce from the Boyd Center for Economic Research. Dr. Bruce, welcome. And you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a great pleasure to be back with this group to share a little bit about what we think the situation might be with the economy and tax revenues. We appreciate the work of this board, and we are grateful for the opportunity to participate in the conversation. So let me just jump straight to it. I appreciate the background, the setup with the macroeconomic picture. I won't belabor those statistics again, but I will drill down into Tennessee data as best I can with great appreciation for Ms. Grafey's presentation. Where do I aim? There we go. Okay, so we'll start with the big picture. Are we in recession? It's everybody's first question these days. Our view is no. The answer is no. We don't seem to be anywhere near, honestly, a recession of a meaningful sense of the National Bureau of Economic Research sort of situation. We tend to focus primarily on the growth rate and inflation adjusted gross domestic product to be that first indicator of recession. And real GDP, as we refer to it, has been growing at slow, stable rates following the rather erratic period of the pandemic and the two-period statistical recession that we saw several quarters ago. But the current data continue to surprise. The most recent GDP growth information was indeed very surprising on the high side. And I think what's really important for this group is that this translates importantly into any tax revenue forecast for the state of Tennessee. Now, before I get into those data, Our basis for state revenue forecasting really comes from the four primary themes that you'll hear. First and foremost, as you see, slow to zero real or inflation adjusted economic growth nationally. 2, a generally better economic situation for the state of Tennessee compared to the United States overall. 3, lingering troublesome inflation, which will continue to prop up collections. And then finally, fairly significant policy changes, which we will talk about, which have reduced the growth rate of collections relative to what might have been experienced absent those policy changes. So back to economic growth, the first really integral component of tax revenue forecasts. Tennessee has been leading the nation for quite some time. Last year, we were the second fastest growing state in the country behind Idaho. That's an answer to a good trivia question. Most people never guess the fastest growing state, but we came in at number 2, following our number 1 placement in 2021. Astoundingly high economic growth at 4.3% last year relative to the US at 2.1%. If we look back a little further in time to the period since the Great Recession in the mid-2000s, our economic growth in Tennessee has been on average 2% per year, again, significantly above the US trend at 1.66% and well ahead of most of the other AAA rated states that we have here for comparison. And I know that's a source of pride for the state of Tennessee, and we see no reason for that differential trend to stop anytime soon. But to the big story a year ago and continues to be the big story today for this group, inflation remains troublesome. It remains a little too high for comfort, especially for the Federal Reserve, but also for our purposes as economists. For a variety of supply and demand reasons, we saw prices spike considerably during and immediately after the pandemic. Our 2 most significant revenue sources in Tennessee, the sales tax and franchise and excise taxes, saw incredible growth during that time because they are functions of the prices of things. And when inflation is high, collections are high as well. Those days are virtually over. And I think that's a theme we're going to come back to throughout the day. The recent interest rate hikes are absolutely showing signs of an effect. And we may anticipate at least one more interest rate hike at some point, although I think the odds of that may be a little lower after the more recent data since we submitted these forecasts about a week and a half ago. We definitely anticipate a long pause eventually in interest rates, followed by a very interesting and unusual slow retreat in interest rates, unlike what we typically see in expansionary monetary policy situations in recessionary environments. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But as we discussed a year ago, despite the recent inflation and monetary policy actions to slow down the macroeconomy, the current situation really isn't quite yet resembling a recessionary environment. What we have here is employment growth for Tennessee in orange, and I will absolutely continue to show Tennessee data in orange with all due respect to my colleagues from East Tennessee State who are in the room today. When you see orange lines, I'm typically referring to a Tennessee trend with the U.S. shown in dark blue. Job growth for a long time in the both series averaged slightly less than 2% before the pandemic. The pandemic took us all over the place. We had a very erratic period of employment decline followed by expansion, and we're settling back in towards those longer term trends. And so the most recent data would suggest we're slightly less than 3%, still very hot compared to that 10-year average pre-pandemic. Tennessee has exceeded U.S. job growth rates in general, although both are indeed trending back toward longer-term sustainable trends. And you've seen versions of this picture before. I won't belabor this. I know Secretary Hargett features this prominently in his regular reporting. Tennessee employment just before the pandemic stood at 3.15 million Tennesseans working. And we very quickly recovered from those very substantial pandemic job losses. Quicker than most other states, we were back above 3.15 million in December 2021. And we have continued to add substantially to Tennessee employment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as of the most recent data, we're in excess of 3.3 million jobs in Tennessee. Unprecedented, really, employment levels and job growth in Tennessee. Now, all of this would suggest continued underlying economic strength. And with the labor market, that is absolutely the first thing we're looking at when we look for that sign of strength. There's been an incredible growth in employment. In Tennessee, we've seen Non-farm employment growth since the Great Recession above 18% in total, well above the U.S. at 13.3%. Again, strong fundamentals in terms of the state's economic situation, looking back to as far as the Great Recession. Across the country, Tennessee and the Southeast more generally are driving U.S. national employment growth. We see much higher rates of employment growth in those southeastern states, but Tennessee at 5.7% compared to pre-pandemic peak, at or well above most other states, certainly in the top 10, and well above that U.S. of 3% during that same time period. Employment in Tennessee has recovered in all sectors now. A year ago, we were still looking for that final push from leisure and hospitality. What you see here on the negative side, the solid orange bars are the pandemic job losses, followed by the orange and white sections, the end zone, if you will, the job gains since the pandemic expansion. In all sectors, we've exceeded and had net job growth across the board. And the job growth has been fairly evenly distributed across the state of Tennessee, with the notable exception of Middle Tennessee, notably Nashville, Murfreesboro, and Franklin MSA, up 46.2% since the Great Recession in the mid-2000s. Simply astounding rates of employment growth here in the mid-state area. But the growth has been very solid in other areas as well, with Clarksville, Cleveland, and Knoxville above the state average growth, and most other areas very closely behind that. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Chair, that the Kingsport, Bristol area has finally achieved a net gain in employment since the Great Recession. We appreciate that. And it's nice to be able to say that all of the major metro areas of Tennessee have shown employment growth since the Great Recession. Now, here's where we start to see some interesting pressures. That growth, alongside with what we'll talk about, you've already seen some data with labor force participation, we have continued to maintain incredibly low unemployment rates, both nationally and in the state of Tennessee. We've recently seen our record low unemployment rate. We're still just slightly above that now. Nothing at all that would suggest recessionary environment when it comes to the employment market. This is very, very important as we think about the supply of available workers. 3.2% sounds very low, but a lot of that has been driven by a reduction in labor force participation. And so if you see here, the Tennessee labor force participation rate in orange has been on a long-term downward trend, really since the Great Recession and before, and a couple of percentage points below the U.S. labor force participation rate during that same period of time. We quickly recovered some of the pandemic losses in labor force participation, only to see those erode within the next couple of years. Fortunately, the most recent data do show us back on an upward trend, quite a bit below the U.S. average, though. In Tennessee, our labor force participation rate remains annoyingly below 60%, 59.4% in Tennessee relative to 62.8% for the U.S. And that is well below the pre-pandemic peak of 62% and the longer-term peak of 67% back in the 1990s. So the main thing here is the loss of labor force has not been a pandemic situation. It's a long-term decline relative to economic and demographic trends more broadly than the COVID-19 pandemic. When it comes to the Tennessee labor market, this is probably among the more important pictures I'll show you as lead into the revenue forecasting that I'm going to get into. This really gives you a very clear picture of the shortage of Tennessee workers that we face right now. The blue line is labor demand, so that's total employment plus all open positions, all job openings. The orange line is labor supply, so that's total employment plus the number of unemployed people who would like to have a job. If we put every single unemployed person to work, we would still have a very large number of unfilled job openings. The gap right now in the most recent data between labor supply and labor demand is about 120,000 workers. That's how short we are in terms of maintaining balance in the labor market. You see that as the vertical distance between those two. And demand has outpaced supply for most of this pandemic recovery, and certainly for the last couple of years. That, of course, is placing considerable upward pressure on earnings. It's giving people purchasing power. We've seen some data on wage growth as well. Our Personal income per capita is slowly catching up, slowly making ground on U.S. average. U.S. total per capita personal income about 65,423. We're just below that at 58,279. And I think it's important that we were a lot further below that U.S. average within the last several years. We've caught up to the Southeast average, and we continue to lead as earnings growth has been quite strong given the strength of the Tennessee labor market. So a few more quick notes on vehicles and housing before I get into the tax revenue situation. Light vehicle sales have shown a declining trend in terms of national data recently in the last few years, although the most recent data suggests a rebound. We are not projecting a return to the pre-pandemic highs in terms of light vehicle sales. There continues to be considerable transition in that industry. And I think a lot of folks, not unlike the adoption of any new technology, are in wait and see mode with a lot of the newer technology, especially when it comes to electric vehicles. A lot of folks are also intimidated by high interest rates on car loans and lack of supply, and of course, the very aggressive price increases that we've seen in the auto market. And then we're really paying very close attention to the auto market in terms of labor market stability as well. And those factor in to our macroeconomic forecasts and certainly into our sales tax and other tax revenue forecasts as well. Housing, we've seen in the recent data annual rates of appreciation approaching 25%, simply unprecedented in the real estate market, fortunately retreating to more normal, if I may use that word without getting too many pencils thrown in my direction. We don't use that word very often either, but much more sustainable lower rates of sales price growth in real estate markets. That's really important. It will have a negative impact, as you'll see, on a couple of our revenue series, but the housing market seems to be trying to return to something more like a sustainable trend. But with the influx of people and their dollars, we've seen house prices bid up considerably. And when you have a relatively fixed supply, prices go up very quickly. We are seeing some signs of return to normalcy here with increased numbers of active listings on the real estate market and longer times on the market for those listings, returning back to something a little closer to average, but still below long-term peaks in those series. Healthy return to a more sustainable path. The supply side also is showing some refreshing resiliency now with an increase in the most recent data in terms of permitting for new housing units in Tennessee. So we have to have this supply response. Given the tremendous increase in demand that we've seen over the past couple of years, we need this supply response to get those prices back into a more normal territory, more sustainable trend territory. And we're seeing that largely in middle and eastern Tennessee, but this is something we'll continue to pay attention to going forward. Now, let's get to the punchline, the revenue forecast. And I deliberately use a very small font here. There are lots of numbers on the screen. It is and continues to be a very, very difficult time to forecast revenues. Let me just say that up front. These are really unprecedented times. Going back to pre-pandemic, volatility is the name of the game, and statistical models are notoriously hard to pin down given the data fluctuations that we've seen in the last few years. We're essentially predicting, to cut to the bottom line, flat nominal growth or unadjusted actual dollar growth in total revenues for FY24, followed by a slightly more positive rate of growth in total collections in FY25. These will be buoyed by strong sales tax collections, which are offsetting flagging franchise and excise and privilege tax collections, which we're seeing in the year-to-date collections already. But this is really important. Total revenues will still be well above the long-term trend. At $22 billion total, we are still about 40% above pre-pandemic collections. Don't let that fact be lost in this conversation about growth rates that are less than 1% in positive terms. We could hold at this level for another year or two and maybe 3 and still be above the long-term revenue collections trend in Tennessee. So very, very good news in that sense. We predict slightly slower general fund growth, minus 0.7% this fiscal year before returning to 0.8% for FY25. The performance of the past few years is really simply unsustainable. We know that. We've talked about it. We talked about it a year ago. We'll probably talk about it as long as those peaks and the 15+% growth are in the data in these meetings. And returning to a pre-pandemic trend is really a big drop in growth rates, but not so much in terms of total collections. So if I can show a little bit of time series history for total collections and sales tax collections, in this case, I divert a little bit from my usual use of orange for Tennessee. Now it's orange as the sales tax growth rates. We saw 2 years back to back above 15% in total and in sales tax collections. Those were driven largely by underlying strong economic growth post-pandemic, short-term stimulus, as we've talked about a lot in this room, very, very high inflation, and some really well-timed policy changes driven by Supreme Court decision that enabled state governments to collect taxes on internet sales. Those things all contributed to one-time increases in growth rates that we knew were not sustainable, and we're seeing that in the real data right now, a return to sustainable trend. And most of this growth, in fact, has been inflationary in these past couple of years. If we take out the effects of inflation, the orange line now is total revenues adjusted for inflation. We see actually in our forecast, we're predicting negative inflation adjusted growth for the horizon, the next 2 years. Inflation will eventually return to that Federal Reserve target rate of 2%. We project that's going to take some time to get there. So we've got a little bit of inflation above those levels here for the next couple of fiscal years. But in general, revenue growth going forward is going to be determined by underlying economic conditions, demand growth, inflation, and tax-related policy changes. While growth is going to remain, in our expectation, slow and stable and positive, but not off the charts, inflation we expect to return to normal, and that's going to take away from our expected revenue growth going forward. Policy changes, we have built those into our forecast projections here. So what you see is, I think, some pretty prudent spending over the last policy cycle to make some adjustments to tax policy that haven't taken us into negative growth territory. We would certainly be seeing stronger revenue growth were it not for those policy changes, but maybe at the expense of less activity. We don't know. We can't forecast in that sense what might have happened in the absence of those. But we're projecting slightly negative inflation adjusted growth in FY24 and 25. And again, holding on that $22-ish billion collections. I think, 3-4 years ago, we might have been seen as ridiculous for forecasting collections at that level. It seems like a disappointment relative to where we've been, but it's really still well above that long-term revenue trend. So at this point, I'll be happy to entertain questions, comments here for you.
Thank you very much, as always, for being with us. Appreciate again. There's a lot here that is very interesting, and a lot we could spend a lot of time on. What would you say in the immediate term is the biggest challenge for the Tennessee economy?
The biggest challenge for the Tennessee economy. Thank you for that excellent question, Mr. Chair. I will do my best. There are several that we keep track of. The biggest challenge right now for the Tennessee economy, I think, continues to be availability of adequately trained and appropriately located workers. If it were the case that we could actually fill those job openings and return to something more of a balance where the jobs are a little more precious, I think we'd have a little bit more long-term stability in the workforce right now. As it stands, the worker still holds all the power. People can move around and demand greater pay and greater benefits because there are 2 openings for every 1 unemployed person. It remains a very significant challenge for the Tennessee economy. I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention susceptibility to the geopolitical factors at play around the world. Nobody will be immune from those issues if they are not appropriately contained and resolved as soon as possible. Again, the human life element being the most significant, but the economic implications could be quite significant if things get worse, I suppose, in a geopolitical situation there. But really, at this point, I think the underlying fundamentals are quite strong. I think those are low probability events that could derail this ongoing stable, slow growth rate that we're seeing. The median projection, if you will, our central tendency at this point is for business as usual.
And thank you. You addressed really what was going to be my second question there, talking about the world events. Talk just a minute about the labor force in Tennessee. Who is missing in Tennessee? Laurel told us about people 55 and older missing in her presentation. Is that the same segment we're missing in Tennessee? Who are we missing in Tennessee?
And people everywhere in every industry and every education level. We're growing jobs much more quickly at the college educated and higher levels of education, but the openings continue to be across the board. We have seen a dramatic decline in labor force participation in the 55 plus. And to me, that my message to those people, I hope to be one of them one day, is good job. You've done well. You've sold a piece of property, perhaps. You've enjoyed an early retirement buyout. You've done the things you set out to do, and you've retired maybe a little bit earlier than you thought. You've won. We don't need to use policy to correct that outcome. But if we have folks who would be working, could be working, and perhaps are not in the area where the jobs are located, or don't have the technology or the transportation or the childcare or the affordable housing to be able to take those jobs, then those are things we should be addressing with policy at this point. I won't get too specific with those things, but those continue to be pressures. But at this point, I think the labor force participation declines among those in the prime age segments continue to be problematic, and it's really every industry and every education level.
One area we have seen exponential growth in Tennessee in the past year or two is tourism. And from my standpoint, it's only anecdotal, but the service sector seems to be missing. You talk about the growth in jobs requiring college education, but it seems like there is just an underlying weakness in the service sector, and there's so many people missing from that segment, which of course, as you say, drives up wages and things like that for the people who are working, which of course drives up the cost of enjoying tourism. That's such a key to Tennessee's economy. How does the softness in employment or having workers to do the service jobs, how does that affect our economy as a whole?
Huge part of the state economy. It's an excellent question and very good points made there. And I think it's really important to continue to focus on that sector because it is so important to the Tennessee economy. What we have seen, though, is net job creation in that sector since the pandemic. So that's the first point. There are actually more people working in that sector than before the pandemic. What that suggests is the growth in that industry has been phenomenal. The growth has actually outpaced the available supply. And so it's also really noteworthy that those are the sectors where we see the labor shortage very visibly. We don't go to the shop floors and manufacturing employment establishments in Tennessee. We don't visit VW. We don't visit all of our major employers on a regular basis to see their pressures. But we do go to the store. We go to the restaurant. We go to entertainment venues, and we see it very much firsthand, that shortage in labor. That just means demand has grown faster than supply. So what has happened during the pandemic, and I think I refer to it lots of different ways, but everyone who had an opportunity to move up did. The job growth has been astounding across the board. So folks who were in those positions might have had an opportunity to move into a managerial position or even own the enterprise outright or start their own startups off the charts. Secretary, we've shown that quarter after quarter in Tennessee, tremendous growth in new firm formation. But the thing about it is that growth rate has been so high that it opens up more opportunities. And when those opportunities are unfilled, we feel the pressure as consumers every day. The really wonderful thing is we're still Tennessee. We're still a great place to come and enjoy our tourism sector and our service sector. You might have a longer wait in line. You might not get the full service that you're used to, but at the same time, we're working on that imbalance in the labor market there. And I think what we'll see is as the equilibrium returns across the Tennessee labor market, those jobs will actually become more valuable. Importantly, this puts pressure on employers to really rethink their employment strategies as well. You're going to see more point of sale technology. You're going to see less people and more self-check, for example. there's no choice. We have to do those things or we're going to absolutely lose the customers entirely. So the businesses that are able to adapt with technology to supplement their workforce and take care of their workforce and protect and retain those workers are the ones that are going to succeed into this next era of a really high-tech service industry.
Interesting. Members, any other comments or questions? Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Always fascinating, so I appreciate that. I want to ask about the F&E taxes, a couple of questions first on that. First of all, when you did this last year, the General Assembly passed the Tennessee Works Act. Was that part of your calculations?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. We would not be doing our job to come in and tell you what we think revenues would have been had we not done those things. They've been done. They were important changes in our F&E taxes. A variety of concerns and pros and cons went into those conversations. They absolutely are reducing the rate of growth of collections in F&E, but that was a deliberate move. That was intentional. And so they are cooked into this for sure.
And that may be partly the answer to my next question as well. I know when I look at the F&E taxes, they're down significantly both in FY24 and 25 in your forecast, and yet sales taxes are up a little bit in both of those years. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship and why you think that the business taxes are going to be lower than the sales taxes that those businesses are collecting?
Really, excellent question. It's obvious. It's an interesting juxtaposition of positive and negative, right? And I think there really comes down to a couple of things. First of all, the policy changes were more impactful in percentage terms on the F&E side than on the sales tax side. The Tennessean at the store sees more of the sales tax holiday, but the businesses definitely are enjoying the benefits more of that recent set of policy changes on the F&E side. We've seen a lot of interesting negative year-to-date collections with F&E, driven a lot by overpayments and refunds, as we've talked about. This issue with sales is driven by, I think the phrase that we saw in the previous presentation was stubbornly high consumption, and that translates into stubbornly high retail sales. Inflation is the name of the game there. I think inflation will have a much more meaningful impact on the sales tax collections in the FY24 period as we continue to travel closer to that 2% sustainable long-term rate. On the F&E side, given the policy changes that we've seen, given the high interest rates that we expect to be around for quite a long time compared to previous monetary policy experiences, I think we expect to see the bite of those actually taking a little bit longer to show up in Tennessee. I think what we've seen, and we had this earlier conversation about this in the previous presentation, the cash balances are also on the hands of the companies. Companies have had access to significant stores of cash post-pandemic, and the high interest rates haven't had as much of an impact on investment decisions because they've been able to cash finance in several key areas. But that's not a permanent situation. I think those interest rate hikes will eventually show up, and we think they'll show up in F&E collections. That, with the policy changes, would explain most of the negative on the F&E side. Sales tax collections will continue to be propped up a little bit by a slight inflation, strong economic growth, and not as substantial in revenue terms policy changes on the sales tax side.
And you just made me think about when you're talking about the sales taxes. So the FY25 numbers, the growth rate, is that over the collections for 24, which would include the 3 months of grocery sales tax?
Yes, that's relative to the previous year. Yes.
On the actual collection.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And then the other question I had was last year when we had these meetings, one of the things that we kind of drove some of the percentages that were significantly higher than this were you and others talked a lot about net in-migration. Nobody's talked about that today. Can you kind of give a little bit of a sense of is that as much of a factor this year, or, and I assume it's baked in, but can you just talk about that for a moment?
That's a big part of, excellent question. I apologize for not including that in the presentation this year. I would love to have gone on and on about demographic trends in Tennessee. You know, last year we saw the first year of negative natural population growth in Tennessee, where deaths exceeded births for the first time in the data. Yet population grew substantially because we brought 83,000 new residents into the state of Tennessee during that time, which allowed us to try to keep up with some of that labor market shortage. That is absolutely core to our sales tax projections going forward, because you might move here at age 56 or 7 or 8, retired early with lots of cash in pocket. You might bid up those house prices, but you also go to the stores and buy a lot of things that are taxable under Tennessee sales tax. And so that has absolutely added measurably to the last several years of sales tax collections growth. We are not going to be in the business of projecting that kind of in-migration simply out of basic conservative forecasting principles, but we really don't see any reason for it to slow down other than there must be a top end to it somewhere. Tennessee continues to be an attractive destination state for people and for their businesses. And we're seeing that continue to play out in the data. That will give us continued upward pressure in that underlying demand growth for sure.
Thank you.
Member, Ms. Secretary or Treasurer.
Doctor, do you see any effect on our sales tax collections or other revenues from the fiscal policy of the United States government, or rather the lack thereof, i.e. the large annual deficits that we're running now and are going to be foreseeable for as far as the eye can see at this point? Do you see any effect on those, on Tennessee's situation as a result of that?
Mr. Treasurer, I appreciate that question. It's something I study a lot, much more of a federal policy person, and the ongoing annual deficits, on the order of a third to a half to 2/3 to a couple of years of over the size of the federal government budget. $1 trillion plus deficits are simply unsustainable, and the long-term trend is upward in those deficits. That continues to contribute on one hand to economic growth because every dollar that's spent goes straight into GDP. And a lot of Americans are earning those dollars in salaries, and they're turning around and spending those dollars and generating tax collections for state governments, not just Tennessee, but everywhere, and federal collections as well. But we know those bills are due at some point. You know this better than anyone else, and the interest continues to pile up. And so every dollar we borrow adds some cents to deficit interest spending, and those costs have gone up substantially, such that net interest on the debt is one of the major spending categories at the federal level right now, simply unsustainable. I have not much optimism. I wouldn't say no optimism for a reversal of that anytime in the near term future. I think everyone realizes it's a problem. Everyone realizes it's not a problem that gets solved by spending cuts or tax increases. We'll need to do some of each to turn this ship around and get the House back in order. As far as the impact on the economy, we saw very clearly a positive impact of expansionary fiscal stimulus in the last 3 years in this country. And it's easy to look back and say we did too much in response to the pandemic, but the economy would have been worse off if we had not done that. We bought ourselves continued employment, continued business solvency and resiliency. We also bought unprecedented in our recent history rates of inflation. And economic growth that has really been off the charts as a result of that. Now, what we have is a fairly effective, in my view, Federal Reserve monetary policy to try to counteract some of that. And we're slowly getting things back under control, fortunately, in the absence of continued fiscal policy stimulus. This economy does not need to be stimulated right now. It needs to be slowly brought back under control, and the Federal Reserve is tasked with that challenge right now. Going forward, I don't think there's much taste for expansionary fiscal policy. I wouldn't expect that to prop up short-term growth rates or collections going forward. I do feel like the long-term costs are still out there. They're going to be out there, and that will be a drag on growth when we really start to pay those bills. Hopefully we do that within my lifetime. We shall see.
Understanding as we do that, Tennessee's sales tax collections are highly dependent on sales of light trucks, cars, durable goods, whole home furnishings, et cetera, that typically involve consumer credit and everything. Do you see anything at the federal level that may limit the availability of that credit in the future or have an adverse effect on it?
Well, I think we've seen some data today of an uptick in default on some of the credit card debt and other household debt. It needs to happen. And that's intentional. It needs to happen. We need to rein that in and slow that down a little bit. That will have a more negative impact on sales. I can assure you our sales tax collections forecast would be higher were it not for this increase in consumer debt, increase in interest rates. Those things haven't seemed to have the bite yet on the American consumer. And I'll be really watching carefully through the holiday season to see if this stubbornly high rate of consumption growth continues, but I would expect at some point soon a reckoning there and a reevaluation of priorities. But that being said, people have reevaluated work, life, consumption, nesting at home, improvements to the home, vacations, everybody's traveling again, with really no signs of reversal because they are feeling strong in their job. They are feeling strong in their earnings right now. And that will continue to give us higher than higher sales tax collections than what might otherwise be the case.
So are you saying that you factored that into your calculations at this point? So you think we should not add an additional factor to it in terms of our review of the situation?
I would be comfortable saying that my forecast would be higher were it not for those expected pressures. I don't expect those to turn us into negative territory with sales tax, but certainly we could be seeing a slightly higher rate of growth in sales tax collections were it not for those forces. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman, just
Secretary.
Just real quickly, and I come into this presentation every year, and I keep saying it can't continue. Use the word, and I have been wrong. Fortunately, I've been wrong for several years, and now today you've used the word unsustainable, and I hope that's not right. I hope we are beyond the estimates you've given. I do have a question. The previous presenter talked about wage growth. And we know, based on your presentation and history and what the Treasury just mentioned a moment ago, is a sales tax dependent state. How realistic is that wage growth, the growth in wages for Tennesseans that we saw in the previous presenter's chart? Because, I have a real concern that, number one, it's not sustainable. Number two, that an expectation has been created in the labor market that every year they're going to see a certain rate of growth. And then I worry when they don't see that, what their desire to continue to participate in the labor market is. So there's several things I would just love for you to pontificate for a moment if you have anything to offer.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that question. The labor market imbalance is very real in the state of Tennessee, and that places upward pressure on wages. I think it's very real. I don't know that it's a permanent condition. I hope it's not a permanent condition. We need to at least have balance at some point, if not an actual surplus of workers, to get back to that situation where the jobs are more precious and we don't expect 5% or 4% or even 3% pay raises every single year just to feel like we're keeping up. It was appropriately stated that the appropriate focus has to be on wage growth relative to price growth. And what we're seeing now is wage growth in excess of price growth for the first time in a while. And that's been really good. I don't think it's a permanent situation. I don't think we should expect it to be a permanent situation. But we would certainly hope the long-term trend is for wages to grow faster than prices so that people at least feel like the standard of living is growing slowly over time. It's those periods when wage growth falls below price growth, like we saw in 21 and 2, where we really do feel like, even though the economy is ticking right along, people feel like they're in a personal recession.
To that point, you have baked in the thought that wage growth is going to continue to exceed the CPI.
And wage growth, I think, if I may expand on that just for a second, in Tennessee should continue to be quite strong relative to the U.S.
Members, any other comments or questions? I'll ask one more, just because it's somewhat startling to me, what you talked about with the negative population growth when you calculate births versus deaths, and that we've slipped into having more deaths than births. Of course, we've had astounding population growth, net in-migration, but the persons moving to Tennessee could be of an age, retirement age, or perhaps past the typical childbearing times. Do you have any thoughts on how that trend might move in the future?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that question. We are the Tennessee State Data Center as well in the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. We do the state's populations projections every single year. I would be happy to refer you to those data, but let me give you just a taste of it now. What we're seeing with that negative natural population growth or natural population decline is simply the aging of the population. The baby boom generation is moving through. They're in or post-retirement right now. Death rates as a share of the population will naturally increase as a result of that. What's perhaps more troubling is this long-term decline in fertility. the delay in household formation, the delay in child rearing among younger Tennesseans that has driven down the birth rate as a share of the population. It's not able to keep up to the extent that we would have natural population growth like we enjoyed for several decades. The long-term trend is a continuation of that. Unfortunately, we will continue to have to bring workers in at various stages of life. Hopefully, younger than the 55 plus will bring those workers in and create lifetime Tennesseans out of them, just like they did for me when I was in my mid-20s in late 1999, moved into Tennessee and have continued to reside here. That's the solution to the labor market situation in Tennessee right now. Fortunately, people still want to be here. We do need to pay attention to those forces that could counteract that. The housing price situation, the child care availability and cost situation, congestion, infrastructure demand, all of these things add up to quality of life. And fortunately for everything else, we're really well above average, leading the nation in many respects as a destination state.
Thank you. Do you see that same trend in our other states that border us, or even nationally, or is that something we're standing out on right now?
I think Tennessee has certainly stood out in terms of the in-migration, and we're seeing it.
Well, I mean the equation, the birth-death equation.
That part is very common across all states in the nation right now.
But the first time for us in recent times.
That's right. Thanks for that,
Thank you.
Clerk.
Thank you. But we do stand out in the terms of in-migration, the number of people that want to be here.
Certainly do.
Gratefully.
Yes.
Members, other questions or comments? Thank you very much, as usual, for your presentation. Next up, we have from ETSU, Dr. John Smith, Dr. Joseph Newhart, and Dr. Fred McCara. Come on down. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. You all are recognized.
I want to thank you again for inviting us to this presentation. It's always interesting, fascinating to hear all the reports that we get, and there are some really smart people in this state. It's great to have them make a presentation here. Last year when I had the pleasure to visit the Tennessee Funding Board, I expressed concern over the likelihood of a recession in 2023. And I wasn't alone in stating that concern, as other presenters also were warned about that possibility. Well, sometimes it's good to be wrong. Granted, the year isn't over yet, but I think at least the economy has made it through 83% of this year, so I think we might be able to finish it without any contractions. But what about next year? Once again, there are concerns about the continuity of the current expansion. In short, the economy has been expanding at a steady, but not exactly a spectacular rate. But I would argue that moderate but steady growth is preferable to unsustainable expansion followed by painful returns to quote unquote normalcy. So with that in mind, what do we see in some major barometers of recent economic conditions and which lay the groundwork for what we might expect next year? There we go. I will start with a chart that shows new claims for jobless benefits. This is a measure of labor market conditions that have been a reliable forward indicator of overall business conditions. And since 2022, new claims have been relatively stable at a rate that is consistent with historical standards. The next chart shows data from the Labor Department's monthly job openings and labor turnover survey. Following the brief but severe recession in 2020, job openings continue to exceed hires by a substantial margin. The positive inference here is that employment opportunities are quite prevalent. And that is consistent with a healthy labor market. There are jobs that are available. But the negative inference is that these labor market opportunities and the production and income that they would generate are not being fulfilled. A similar trend is seen in this next chart of the labor force participation rate. This is a percentage of the adult population that is in the labor force, either employed or seeking employment. Although it has returned to its level prior to the COVID recession, it remains below peak levels seen at the beginning of this century. This reflects the continuing exit from the labor force of the baby boomers, which was alluded to before, and which is likely to continue and even increase in the coming years. As a member of kind of the advanced guard of that baby boom, I'm retired now, so I can identify with that. The next chart shows the return of women to the labor force following the 2020 recession has slightly exceeded that of men. The market for both new and existing home sales bounced back strongly after the recession, but went into a rather deep dive. While that drop has continued for existing home sales, new home sales have seen something of a recovery since the middle of last year. And new home sales carry with them a number of benefits, including increased employment in the construction industry, expenditures for furniture and appliances. And how long this trend is going to continue will depend upon a number of factors, including Fed policy decisions that may raise interest rates. After-tax personal income and consumer spending appears to have returned to longer-term trends. And that's obviously of importance to a state government or state that the government revenues are closely linked to consumer purchases of goods and services. Expenditures on services, of course, are by far the largest category, and they were hit so hard by the COVID and related public health policies. Finally, they're growing again at what appears to be a solid rate. Likewise, spending on durable goods has been encouraging. Expenditures on these typically big ticket items are often seen as evidence of consumer confidence in their financial circumstances. For consumers, a major positive in the economy has been a significant slowing of inflation. Nevertheless, the rate of price increases is still rather high by pre-recession standards. Here we see three measures of inflation: the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, the Producer Price Index, or PPI, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCEPI. Finally, consumer attitudes about the economy, well, they haven't exactly been reassuring. Although a widely used measure of consumer attitudes has improved somewhat since hitting an all-time low last year, it remains low and continues to fluctuate. And this may suggest that consumers remain rather skeptical about the economy and their personal circumstances. So in summary, the economy has improved compared to where it was last year at this time. However, the risks to the economy are many and come from a variety of sources that go beyond purely economic and domestic origins. Among these is the growing instability in the Middle East, a presidential election, and legal battles involving the major candidates in that election. While these are not specifically economic in nature, they affect consumer and business attitudes, and that can impact the economy negatively in the nation and in our state.
In projecting the next few years for the Tennessee economy, we focused on trends in labor and capital. Tennessee has a strong and growing economy, and we expect state revenue to continue growing in the long run. There is potential for a recession in the next year, which may reduce tax revenue in the short run, but not in the long run. While some states saw population decline during the pandemic, the Tennessee population hit 7 million for the first time in 2022. The state population grew 3.2% over 2019, adding 221,000 residents in 3 years. Since we measure our economy by the production of goods and services, we're interested in whether these new residents are workers or retirees. Private non-farm employment rose by 161,000 from the end of 2019 through this September to 3.3 million, with workers accounting for 73% of the population growth. Tennessee unemployment rate is very low, 3.2% in September versus 3.8% for the United States. 3.2 matches the lowest months for Tennessee unemployment in 2019, indicating a return to normalcy in that respect for our economy. However, the labor force participation rate is lower than for the country, 59.4% statewide versus 62.8% for the United States. This probably reflects a greater proportion of retirees here. LFPR is also uneven across counties, ranging from 70.8% in Davidson County to 48.3% in Unicoi County, for example. Real output grew 12.9% between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2023. State real GDP stands at $375 billion this year in 2012 dollars. When I moved here in 2016, it was $310 billion. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Tennessee saw the highest real GDP growth in the United States from 2021 to 2022 and stands at $502 billion in nominal dollars for 2023, ranking it the 15th largest state economy, although only 31st in output per capita, which is also tied to our lower labor force participation rate. Business applications across all industries spiked during the pandemic and remain elevated, indicating sustained business growth in the Tennessee economy. A bellwether for recessions is the sale of durable goods, which get hit harder in a downturn. Tennessee has more manufacturing employees than before the pandemic, but growth has also flattened for the past year. Looking at the goods themselves, it's the same story. They're higher than before, but have flattened out for the past year. According to Bloomberg, high interest rates have dampened demand for big ticket durable goods like motorcycles, RVs, boats, and swimming pools nationwide. This category of output will likely decline in the next year before rebounding when rates start to fall again. Another type of durable good is buildings, including residential development, which we need more of to accommodate new residents and ease the shortage of workforce housing. One way to gauge construction activity in the state is to look at employment in the industry, which continues to rise despite high interest rates. Housing permits in Tennessee are up, indicating that producers are responding to high prices by increasing supply. Statewide monthly permits are the highest they have been month to month since before the Great Recession, with almost 3,500 units permitted in the newly updated data for September. This includes all types of units, ranging from single-family homes to apartments. Since January 2020, 184,000 units have been permitted, or about 83 units per 100 new residents. The inventory of home listings is showing improvement, with statewide listings in September just under the number of listings before the pandemic. The number is now 3 times higher than at the bottom, though this is still a third below the few years preceding the pandemic. Median listing prices across the state remain near an all-time high at $450,000 in September, more than doubling in 6 years. The pipeline of residential development in the state could indicate a trend back to a balanced market and some correction in real prices by the end of the decade. The current slowdown in housing can also negatively affect the sales of things like furniture and appliances.
We've had a lot of conversation about what's going on in the state and the trends that we see. One of the trends that we have all been aware of is the fact that we're slowly seeing increasing difference between nominal amounts of tax collections and real dollar collections, certainly within sales taxes. And as we're now seeing something of a downturn in real dollar franchise and excise taxes, and more of a downturn in our privilege taxes, and kind of a flattening out in the gasoline taxes. However, generally speaking, there is an increase in nominal tax returns or tax collections. Now, as you review our forecast, you're no doubt going to see that they're somewhat more optimistic than our colleagues. And this doesn't mean that we fail to recognize the threats to economic growth in Tennessee that they will articulate. Yes, we know that inflation remains persistently high. Yes, we're concerned about the global threats to international trade and supply chains. Yes, we know that restarting student loan payments can place extraordinary stress on the capacity of debtors to consume. And finally, we know that the high interest rates are a drag on the economy. However, we also note that unemployment rates remain extraordinarily low, and that trends in nominal consumption levels have, as you have noted, remained positive and extraordinarily strong. The question for us is whether the negative economic pressures will put sufficient pressure on the economy to choke off nominal growth to the extent that we result in negative nominal growth or a recession. We are, after all, economists and are typically predisposed to embrace the opportunity for a negative forecast. However, this time, we're going to come down after considerable discussion on a more positive revenue forecast for the state. As you can see, we are forecasting a positive nominal growth rate for the state overall. We're forecasting that total tax revenues or collections will be over $22 billion. We're forecasting an increase in sales tax. We're also forecasting an increase in F&E taxes. Why are we doing that? We are of the opinion that given that we're really on the cusp here, if we go in the positive direction, there will be an upward pressure on these sales tax collections. We could be wrong. And to be perfectly honest with you, there's been considerable debate among economists as to which way this is going to go. However, once again, we do see that we have increasing population. We do see that we have strong consumption spending, even though we've had some policy changes with respect to tax collections. For example, let's consider the tax holiday for groceries sales. Here's a question about that. Where does the money that was released by the canceling of the sales tax go? It goes back to the consumers. What do they do with it? Well, they're either going to buy more groceries, or they're going to buy down their debt and save, or they're going to take that money and consume it on products that even have a higher tax rate. So we're of the opinion that it's quite possible that's not going to be that big a drag on the economy. This is what our forecast is, and we stand ready to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much again for coming back before us. Let me ask, it just kind of raised a question in my mind. Do you all have any thoughts on the coming holiday season, what we might see? You know, that money that people save, for example, in August, September, October, if they did set it aside, they might be ready to spend it on the Christmas holidays or the Thanksgiving holidays. Any thoughts on that at all?
I think we're in for a pretty good holiday season.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect it may be a last hurrah if we're going to be pushed over to the edge and go into a recession. I suspect that people are going to have this last hurrah and have strong spending, certainly not phenomenal or moronic spending.
Non-economic factors, I think, are very important here, and I kind of alluded to them with all the things that are going on in the Middle East right now. If people get into a bad mood about something like that, that could actually have a negative impact on the holiday spending. I'm going to remain optimistic about that, but with the understanding that there's a very strong possibility that people will just want to stay home.
With respect to external forces, too, there's another thing that Dr. McCare has mentioned. There is a presidential election coming up. And with respect to Ms. Grafey, I know that the Federal Reserve is totally apolitical and has never made decisions with respect to policy to promote a candidacy of one candidate or another. Nevertheless, I feel that the administration is going to, in fact, do everything they can to support the economy over the next 12 months.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Members, any other questions or comments? Commissioner.
Thank you very much for this. Hard work went into it and really appreciate it. I want to make sure that I'm reading this correctly, so help me to understand. The sales tax for this year, FY24, you've got an increase of about 5.79%, if I'm reading that correctly. So far, we're only up between 1% and 2%, I think. Can you talk a little bit about what you anticipate this year that's going to help us to get a more robust sales tax number, if I'm reading this correctly?
You are. And the question we had was, which way is the economy going to go? Are we going to start to continue to slow down? Or will this extraordinarily high level of personal consumption expenditure actually overpower that? We tend to fall on the side of the fact that people have been spending and will continue to. And although the Secretary has alluded to the question, how long can this keep up? I don't know. Ultimately, there will be a price to pay. But we suspect that it's not this year. That's the bottom line there and with F&E. With respect to 2025, to be perfectly honest with you, forecasts that far out are very unreliable.
Did you, related to F&E, let me ask you the same question I asked Dr. Bruce. Did you take into Tennessee Works into account here?
Yes, we did, and with the sales tax for food.
The grocery tax?
Yes.
Reduction? Okay. That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Treasurer, Mr. Secretary. Thank you all very much again. I'm especially pleased to have you down here from Upper East Tennessee with us again. Thank you very much for being here.
Opportunity to be here, and I just want Dr. Bruce to know that on Saturday football day, we all wear orange socks, so he's not to worry about that. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have from the State Department of Revenue, Commissioner David Girigano and Mr. Jeff Biarkey. Come on down, and you all are recognized. Taxman cometh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. As you mentioned, David Girigano, Commissioner of Revenue, and you know Jeff Biarkey, our Director of Research. And as been our practice for the last few years, I'm going to turn our presentation over to Jeff.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, Mr. Comptroller, members of the board. Let's start. I can get the remote. Just some of what we think are major takeaways from our presentation before we really get into them. To start with is just the volatility of franchise and excise tax and the difficulty of forecasting it. I think I have some slides later that will really talk about that, but suffice to say it's a volatile and sort of hard to forecast tax versus something like sales tax. Second, we have experienced, as everyone has said so far, you're going to see the same chart again, inflation prices that are increasing at a slower rate than they have been. They're still above long-term goal inflation, but nevertheless much lower than it has been. We're also seeing significant impact of increased interest rates on home sales and related taxes. We have, realty transfer and realty mortgage tax in particular in our privilege tax that have been significantly down over the last several months as a result of that. Finally, we see revenue growth as slowing down, but at a high level. Dr. Bruce mentioned it. We were looking at overall revenue in fiscal year 21 of under $18 billion. And we're looking at FY23 revenue and relatively flat 24 and 25 revenues that are of around $22 billion. So low growth over what is really a high base. This next slide just details some of our fiscal year 23 tax revenue. Again, fairly strong growth. We saw total revenue growth in accrual terms of about 4.8%, 4.3% growth in sales, 1.2% growth in franchise and excise taxes. This slide is one that you've seen a bunch of times, but what I want to point out here, and I think this illustrates some of the growth that we've seen in sales and F&E. Ordinarily, we expect the combined share of sales tax and F&E to be about 80%. That's, you know, where it typically stands, and it fluctuates a little bit around there. What we're seeing right now, we saw in FY23, is that sales tax represented 63% of our revenues, and F&E was 22%. So a combined 85%, which is significantly higher than we've seen, and it may point to some. It may be some indication that those taxes have grown out of proportion to what we've seen other revenues growing. Can't read too much into it because we had a year-long holiday on motor vehicle registration fees, and so that brought that share down. But still, it's 85% of total taxes from 2 tax programs is a significant amount of our revenue. I mentioned volatility in franchise and excise tax, and this chart is an illustration of that. It's it's a rolling 10-year standard deviation percent change, which is a whole lot, a mouthful, but it lets us compare the volatility of taxes or dollar amounts that are very different, right? So the total collections amounts of F&E and sales are so much bigger than other things. This allows us to put it into a sort of unitless measure. But what the takeaway here is, franchise and excise tax has always been more volatile than sales tax or total collections, but over time it has gotten relatively more volatile in comparison to those other taxes. So that continues to increase, and it continues to make it harder and harder to forecast. We've been sort of we've seen the upside of that in the last several years, where we've had very rapid growth. And as we'll get to, we think that we may be seeing a different side of it in this year. This is a long-term growth look at franchise and excise tax collections. And there's a couple things about it. One is that we have this really strong historical trend. This chart goes back to 1968. 1968 through 2019, these are in fiscal years. You can almost draw a line through that growth. I mean, it's pretty consistent growth. And then what you see is, a revenue increase and at a rate of increase that is just much different from previous years. We had, but we're seeing some kind of flattening of that. What we're seeing, an interesting thing that we're seeing that isn't on this chart yet, because this goes through FY23, is this sort of change in taxpayer behavior. We're seeing this year-to-date collections, far more, not more in the number of refunds, but more in the dollar amount of refunds. We had FY22, the first 3 months of the fiscal year, we'd seen about $36 million in refunds. FY23, that number was up to 75.7. This fiscal year, the first 3 months, we've processed $108 million of refunds. So that is significant refund of overpayment of taxes. A similar chart here for taxable sales. This is not the sales tax collection. This is the taxable sales that it's based on. And we can see that you really can almost draw a straight line through that growth, like I have done here, up through about 2008, Great Recession. And we see that we had just gotten back to that long-term trend around FY19 when it just took off again. And some of the factors in that growth are a little easier to identify with sales. We had the Wayfair ruling and the related changes to online sales and marketplace facilitators, and we had a lot of inflation over that time. And so the growth in taxable sales really deviated from that long-term trend in a positive direction and got up to a level that is much higher than it would have been. Now, we think that some of that will stay there. I mentioned Wayfair. Those changes are sort of baked into our revenue now. That is the an intercept shift. It shifted the level of tax and not just the rate of increase. But a high rate of increase from inflation, as you've seen over and over at this point today, we've come a lot farther down from that peak in, June of 22 when we were over 9% year over year change. So that's good. It's important to talk about that rate still being above the kind of long-term goal rate. People will say things like, well, if inflation is down, how come, I'm still paying a lot at the grocery store? I mean, it's, the rate of increase has slowed, but the actual prices have not decreased. Another area where we're seeing significant decrease that I mentioned previously is in the sectors that are related to housing. We have sales tax on building materials here. Over the past 6 months, that's from April through September of this year, that sales tax on building materials is down about 4.4%. Privilege tax collections for realty transfer down about 29%. And privilege taxes from realty mortgage are down almost 39%. And so that is just a direct consequence of the fight against inflation and raising interest rates. It's harder to buy a home. People can afford less for the same monthly payment and that sort of thing. This chart shows just the collection trends that we've seen. This is a 3-month moving average that goes back several years. We see that, a takeaway from this is that we're off of this peak, but really back towards that sort of long-term trend that we were on. So it's, slowing down a little bit, but not at this low level. It is, kind of returning to this long-term trend. Some of the indicators for our forecast, though, don't perform as well. The really interesting one here, I think, is this bottom graph, and that is mortgage originations for refinances. We have just above that mortgage origination for purchases, and that is lower, but it's not just at the bottom. The mortgage originations for refinancing is really a logical thing, though. I mean, if you have a mortgage at 3%, you are not going to refinance at 7% if you can help it. So people aren't voluntarily refinancing at the moment. And it's predicted, at least in the Moody's data that we use, to continue at a very low rate and kind of pull down on that privilege tax. This is another one of our sort of standard slides that's a little bit different this time. We have adjusted all of our estimates to include the impacts of the Tennessee Works Act legislation. So those are explicitly accounted for in our numbers, which are here. To get there, though, I want to talk a little bit about our year-to-date collections and where we are at. This includes October numbers, so we're talking about August through October. Still preliminary on October, but the pretty well finished. We did close for the month. Sales tax is up year to date about $50 million, about 1.5% above last year, and that includes these are through October collections, so that includes August and September of the sales tax holiday. So those 2 months are already in our actual collections, but we are up about 1.5%. Franchise and excise tax, on the other hand, year to date, those 3 months down about 9% or $88 million. We have really in those 3 months, 2 relatively small, inconsequential months in terms of F&E. F&E has a very heavy cycle, with tax due dates and that sort of thing. But October is our big month for companies that have filed extensions to come and apply for refunds. And as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing this year more money being requested in the form of refunds than we have in recent years. But on the whole, total collections are down year to date 0.6%, about $31 million down compared to last year. That is that like I said, that does include 2 months of sales tax holiday. So, our bottom line forecast for fiscal year 2024 is about a 0.3% decrease. And for FY25, about a 0.1% increase. So we're talking about essentially flat revenues at around $21.7 billion. And at this point, unless Commissioner Giargano would like to add anything else, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for being here. And let me say thank you to Representative David Hawk for being here. Representative Hawk, glad to have you here. The other 131, I think, are watching online. But appreciate you being here in person. Quick question in regard to the 3-month sales tax holiday that has just concluded. From the data you have, can you tell, do you think Tennesseans bought more groceries in those 3-month periods than they may normally have done because of the sales tax holiday? Do you think that is a effective way to return robust collections to the people?
I think that we have 2 of our 3 months that we have sort of in the books, and we have another one coming. I think it's a little too early to say where that money went exactly. But we did see the level of reported exempt sales has been fairly robust, and so if someone saw a savings on their grocery bill and bought one more item that also was not taxed, that's what we would expect to see. So I think it's a little too early to say from the data, but it seems like it is an effective way to return money to people's pockets.
Thank you.
I'll just echo that a little bit. I think we'll know more after we get the final reporting on the holiday and get all that reconciled. I think we'll be able to answer that question a little better. It is, it's one of the few effective ways we have to get money to everybody, because it's one of the few things we collect tax on from individuals, from, essentially all individuals across the state.
Everybody has to eat.
Yeah, and a lot of states would approach it with the personal income tax, which we obviously are not collecting that, so we can't use that as a mechanism to give relief. So that's one of the few effective ways for us to do that.
Thank you. Members, questions or comments? Commissioner Bryson, then we'll go down here. Commissioner Bryson.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, and thank you for the hard work on this. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of questions really about the F&E taxes. What is driving the volatility of that tax since about 2007, 2008, when it really took changed the curve?
Yeah. Commissioner, thank you for that question. I wish I had a really good answer for that. Franchise and excise tax and corporate taxes in general are tricky to get a handle on because of a number of factors. One of them being that, they're related to a tax base that is income everywhere, that's then apportioned to Tennessee based on some factors. We don't always know what those things are that are going on that's affecting the income before it gets apportioned to Tennessee, and we don't know, it could be based on changes that are happening elsewhere. We also have one source, I think, is some of the changes from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 that have, especially around bonus depreciation, which coupling with that was part of the Tennessee Works Act. What I've read recently, Tax Foundation study about how that has markedly increased business investment in the U.S. by allowing companies to accelerate depreciation on their investments. And so I think that changes in those kind of structure, at the federal level, then it become the starting point for apportioning that income down to Tennessee, and that may be a part of it.
I might just add to that, Commissioner, with F&E, as we've sort of testified to before, a significant percentage of the revenue comes from a relatively small percentage of the taxpayers. And they're paid on their estimated payments. So as they're going through their tax year, they're scheduling estimated payments. It comes at the end of the year, and they determine their liability. And if there's an incentive to make sure you have your liability covered by your estimated payments, to the extent you've overestimated, you have a choice between getting a refund or carrying that forward to the next year. And I think there's a lot that goes on in the tax departments of these big companies when they decide the timing of things. It can affect their, federal tax payments, the timing of when they do this or that, and whether they decide to roll that forward or take a refund. All those things, all those decisions that they make for maybe numerous reasons, which aren't necessarily transparent to us, can affect their decisions and affect collections and timing of collections.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially with a few, not that many actual payers. So will the transition to a single sales factor smooth that out any, do you think? Maybe not.
I don't necessarily have any particular reason to think that would impact that one way or the other.
The only other question I had really was, why is this, over the last 3 years, that's a pretty steep rise in refunds. Is it related to, Commissioner, what you were just talking about? Is it the same idea?
In part, we have a significant amount of money that's rolled forward every year where there are overpayments, and instead of taking a refund, they say, just apply that to my next, just let it roll forward. So that's basically on account with us. But there's no interest being paid. So as the cost of money has significantly increased, when money was really cheap, there was really very little cost to leaving that sitting there. But now there is a significant cost to leaving that sitting there.
Sense. Okay, thank you.
Secretary, did you have a question? Mr. Treasurer?
As a graduate tax attorney myself, who used to represent companies and tax matters and all that, I'm going to renew my annual plea the commissioners used to for establishment of some type of reserve for the state, in terms of F&E refunds, going forward. I mean, we've never really had a reserve. As a result, like y'all described, we've had this issue with refunds hitting us in some years particularly hard. And it makes the difficulty of predicting revenues a little bit more difficult, by not having that. So I'll just renew my plea about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your presentation today. We appreciate it. Thank you. Next up today, the final presentation in regard to revenue estimating is the Fiscal Review Committee, Boyan Savage and Joe Wagenka. You are welcome and you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller and members of the Funding Board. It is truly an honor to be here today. My name is Boyan Savage. I'm Assistant Director of Fiscal Review, and with me is Joe Wagenka, our Chief Economist. Since a lot of what we've prepared here today has already been talked about, and since we have the pleasure of presenting lottery estimates to you immediately after this, we'll try to keep our comments relatively brief.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'll turn it over to Joe at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller and members of the Funding Board. I'm Joe Wagenka, Chief Economist with Fiscal Review. As you know, we finished last year with around 5% growth, a year that started out very strong and then began to tail off as later in the year. As we began to see production slow, interest rates reach 20-year highs, and consumers spent down much of their savings. While there's still some signs of a recession, many indicators show reason for a positive outlook, with some uncertainty of global conflicts and what impacts the 2024 elections may have. And we'll take a look at the major legislative changes that impacted our collections. Real GDP has seen some continued growth and some positive news coming out for the third quarter with advanced estimates of around 4.9%. Looking at the 10-year versus 3-month yield spread, historically when this metric drops below zero and begins to re-steepen, we're nearing a recession, which as you can see is the case right now. But looking at other indicators suggests a more positive outlook. Inflation has come down over the highs in 2022, but we have to keep in mind that inflation is baked into prices. So while there can be a positive impact on sales tax, as consumers pay more for necessities and goods taxed at a lower rate or not at all, sales tax collections are negatively impacted. However, it appears to be moving in the right direction, but not yet to that desired 2% range. The stock market is up considerably compared to this time last year, though lower than the highs from this summer. There are some concerns that may be holding back growth, like the conflict in the Middle East and Europe, and the overall mixed signals about the economy's health. However, the news from last week from the Fed gave the market a boost, almost 5% higher than what we're showing here. One of the positive signals is a strong labor market, as we've seen jobless claims around 216,000, below that 350,000 number that we have seen just before the last couple recessions. The jobs report from last week with unemployment rising slightly and adding 150,000 jobs suggests a bit of a cool down in an otherwise tight labor market, but overall remains strong. And comparing overall employment to previous business cycles, we continue to outperform the previous cycles in the 12 months following the peak. Tennessee employment seems to have made up most of the lost jobs from the pandemic and continues to show strong growth. Hourly earnings in Tennessee continue to rise, which is of course good for sales and many other tax collections, but of course makes the cost of doing business more expensive. Industrial production recovered much of the losses from the pandemic. However, with much of that pent-up demand gone, supply chain issues still existing, and a tight labor market, it's making further growth a bit more difficult. Now looking at the housing sector, mortgage rates remain high, around 8%, with hopes of some rate decreases coming in 24-25. With those higher interest rates, we've seen growth in housing prices slow, but with much of those increases already baked into the record high prices, and with high interest rates, we're seeing lower sales and higher inventories. So as expected, that means a significant negative impact on our privilege tax collections from real estate transfers. Housing permits in the state, though, have recently gone back up slightly as Tennessee continues to see greater population growth than the national average and a strong labor market. While a bit too early to tell, it may signal a stronger housing market in the next 2 years. Debt as a percent of personal income is back to levels more normal over the past 10 years. One thing I'll add here is that the federal forbearance of student loans has ended with the first payments due just this last month. As mentioned, saving rates are down slightly below the more normal 5 to 6% range that we've seen in the past, as consumers spent through much of the stimulus money they received and are now faced with the higher prices. Looking at domestic auto inventories, they're slowly starting to creep back up, though nowhere near pre-pandemic levels. As mentioned, the supply chain is still causing issues, whether it's shipping, parts production, labor strikes. And there's also been a shift among automakers to reduce production and focus on high margin models. So we may never get back to those high inventories that we saw before the pandemic. And we see sales have recovered quite a bit, but still some room for growth with the higher prices and higher interest rates holding back much of that growth. Small business optimism is still down slightly, with quality labor being the top concern, along with the price of labor. And looking at consumer sentiment, it's coming off historic lows, no doubt driven by high inflation that we've seen. But with inflation finally coming down from those highs, we see consumers begin to have a more positive outlook. But that still remains relatively low, as overall prices are still up. And as you know, there's been a number of legislative changes that will impact collections. All of our forecasts account for these changes. $120 million decrease to F&E in year one, and $259 million in year two. $10 million impact to business tax in year one, and $12 million impact in year two. And of course, there's a $110 million impact from the 3-month food tax holiday compared to last year's 1-month holiday. And keep in mind, there is no food tax holiday currently for 24-25, so that's an additional $168 million in collections that we can expect next year compared to the current year. Looking at sales tax, the orange bars show what kind of sales tax growth we would need each month in order to hit our estimate. Keeping in mind the food sales tax holiday for September through November collections, and then an extra day in February to account for the leap year that's reflected in March collections. And to put this in a better perspective, this chart shows how sales tax collections would look if we were collecting the sales tax on food during those 3 months, which, as I said, accounts for about $168 million. And looking at F&E taxes, we've had a few more days of collections than what's shown here, but we're down around 9% year to date, or $88 million. Decreases year to date have been mostly driven by refunds for previous overpayments, and as the taxpayers prefer more cash in hand with the higher interest rates rather than rolling overpayments forward. It's a bit too early to tell how long this trend can or will last, to what extent taxpayers may reduce overpayments going forward. But at a certain point, that means fewer or lower refunds being available. So the unknown timing of this and year-to-date numbers are holding our estimate back a bit for the current year, along with the legislative changes that I mentioned. And looking at our overall outlook, there remains some uncertainty with risks from global conflicts, energy prices, supply chain issues, and continued higher interest rates. It's anticipated the Fed will decrease rates sometime in 24-25. The economy, GDP, still shows some strength despite high interest rates. And a reminder of that extra day that we'll be getting from the leap year in 23-24. The election and possible changes at the federal level in FY 24-25 likely won't have significant impacts until the following year, but any changes in the balance of power could potentially have an impact. And we mentioned the tax holidays, legislative changes. So looking at our numbers, we're estimating 1.11% growth in the current year, followed by 3.37% growth in FY 25. As mentioned, our sales tax will get a boost in FY 25 with the additional 3 months of food tax collections. Privilege tax continues to be a concern with the current mortgage rates, but we expect that to turn at some point in FY 25. And F&E, we forecast a 5.5% drop in the current year, with an increase of around 1.9% next year. So that brings our general fund estimate to $18.89 billion in 23-24, which puts us below the current budget number for 23-24 by about $449 million, and brings our 24-25 general fund number to $19.7 billion. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you all very much for being here and for your presentation. Members, what about any comments or questions? Seeing none, I will say I hope people spend a lot of money on February 29th next year. I mean, that could make us or break us. Thank you all very much. Members, again, any other comments or questions for this final revenue estimating presentation? If not, that concludes the revenue estimating section of today's meeting. We're going to move in to the lottery revenue estimating portion of the meeting. Leading off, don't everybody leave at once. Leading off, we have, again, fiscal review, Boyan Savage and Joe Wagenka. You are recognized this time to talk about the lottery projections.
Thank you again, members of the funding board. Again, my name is Boyan Savage, Assistant Director of Fiscal Review, and with me is Joe Wagenka, our Chief Economist. Fiscal year 22-23 had a relatively strong performance with net lottery proceeds growth of 6.4% and total state proceeds growth, which includes after-school funding of 6.1%. Net revenue increased by about $78 million or 4.2%, primarily as a result of Powerball and Mega Millions sales, which jointly increased by over $73 million. As we will see in a few minutes, the growth in these two games was driven by large jackpot cycles. Total expenses increased by about 3.5% or almost $50 million. Close to 99% of these expenses are comprised of direct gaming expenses, which experienced a 3.3% increase, with the remaining expenses consisting of operating costs, primarily personnel costs, and those increased by 13% last year. This resulted in net lottery proceeds of $497.4 million, representing growth of about $30 million or 6.4%. For comparison, the average 10-year growth rate in proceeds is 4.6%, so last year's growth is quite strong. These proceeds include excess unclaimed proceeds of $896,000. So after school funding represents unclaimed prizes and is part of a different fund. Such funding is limited to $18 million, and all excess funding is allocated to the Lottery for Education account and is reflected in our net lottery proceeds. Unclaimed prizes have exceeded the $18 million threshold for a couple of years now. And finally, as mentioned before, total state proceeds increased by about 6.1% for total growth of about $30 million. Year to date, we're continuing to see strong growth with net revenue up 6.2%, total expenses up 5.1%, and our proceeds growing at about 11.6 million or 9.6% for the first 3 quarters, or for the first quarter, first 3 months of the year. The main reason for such growth is Powerball. Year to date, Powerball sales are up 128% or 26.5 million. The reason for that is obvious in the table on this slide. We have reached a $1 billion jackpot cycle in the first 3 months of the year compared to the highest jackpot of 300 million this same time last year. As a matter of fact, the jackpot kept increasing since Q1 of this year, all the way up to $1.73 billion. Instant ticket sales make up about 80% of our total sales, while Powerball and Mega Millions made up a combined 10.8%, so approximately 91% of our sales come from these 3 games. Cash 3 and Cash 4 add up to about 6%, with all other games representing less than 1% each. Looking at proceeds in a bit more detail, we can see in that small line graph that the proceeds generally follow a steady upward trend. In fact, since the inception of lottery in Tennessee, we've only had 4 years with negative growth. 2 of those years could likely be attributed to pandemic distortions. You can see, especially with Mega Millions, that jackpot-based games have seen significant ups and downs over the last 4 years, driven by varying jackpot cycles. Instant ticket sales increased significantly over the first 2 years of the pandemic and have seen negative growth in the last 2 years. And this is just to highlight that growth. This shows the same information but represented on the monetary scale. So relatively smaller changes in instant games have a sizable impact on our overall lottery sales. So has the pandemic impacted lottery sales, and what does that mean for us today? Here we're just going to look at instant games to minimize the impacts of jackpot cycles. The dark blue bars represent instant ticket sales in fiscal year 18-19, following a relatively typical pattern. When we add sales in fiscal year 19-20, the first year impacted by the pandemic, we see that for the first 10 months of the year, we were at relatively normal levels, but then experienced significant increases in the last 2 months of the fiscal year. Those increases at a minimum correlate with the first round of stimulus payments under the CARES Act. Increased sales continued through most of the remainder of the calendar year before they reached relatively normal levels in December of 2020. Then in January of 2021, we've had a second round of stimulus payments, shortly followed by round 3 under the American Rescue Plan in March of 2021. So what that means for us is that after a couple of years of very strong sales in instant games, likely supported to some extent at least by stimulus payments, we've seen a retreat to more normal levels over the last couple of years. As you can see on this graph, we're approximately back to the pre-pandemic trend line with our instant games. Year to date, our instant ticket sales follow closely the pattern of last year's sales. However, we have still added 7.4 million in additional sales in the first 3 months. Our median estimate of $1.710 billion for fiscal year 23-24 assumes total growth of just over 25 million, or 1.5% over last year. For fiscal year 24-25, we estimate an additional 20 million in growth for a growth rate of less than 1.2%. Jackpot-based games respond strongly to high jackpot cycles, as we can see here in the example of Powerball. While we generally start seeing strong growth in sales when Powerball jackpots reach the $300 million level, really significant increases are observed when we get close to and cross that $500 million threshold. A couple of things we wanted to point out about these jackpot-based games. One is that similar levels of jackpots will not necessarily result in similar levels of sales. There are multiple factors at play here. One is known as jackpot fatigue, where sales for similar jackpot cycles will decrease over time. And that is part of what we're seeing here on this graph with the 2 highest cycles. However, that's not the case with the 2 cycles in the middle. And here are those 2 middle cycles zoomed in. Another major factor that may impact ticket sales is relative status of other games. During the first cycle here, sales were significantly lower than the second. What contributed to that is the fact that during the first cycle, Mega Millions jackpot reached $1.35 billion. So a lot of purchases, a lot of money went to Mega Millions instead. During the second cycle, Mega Millions jackpots were still high, but relatively much lower than in the previous cycle. So Powerball sales responded accordingly. We mentioned earlier that Powerball had a very strong first quarter of this fiscal year with growth of close to 130%. However, last year's performance was also very strong, with sales growing over 21%, primarily due to $1.9 billion jackpot in November of last year. We do anticipate to see some growth this year, but relatively muted growth of about 8%. For the second year, we forecast a retreat with a decrease in sales of 10%. Mega Millions experienced 3 very significant jackpot cycles since the summer of last year, with each exceeding $1.2 billion. Here you can also see a significant impact of jackpot fatigue with decreasing sales with each cycle. The first 2 of those 3 cycles took place in fiscal year 22-23, and the resulting impact is a triple-digit growth for an additional $50 million in sales. We're off to a very good start of this fiscal year with the $1.58 billion jackpot cycle, but with relatively lower sales, as we could see in the previous graph. And as a result, we are estimating very strong growth over fiscal year 21-22, but a decrease in sales relative to last year. For the current year, we estimate sales of 88 million, and we anticipate those sales to decrease in the second year to 77 million. And finally, just a very quick overview of all other games before we present our estimates of net lottery proceeds. After a relatively strong performance during the pandemic, we're seeing Cash 3 and Cash 4 slowly retreating back to pre-pandemic levels, still, however, slightly elevated. These 2 games move very much in line. We indexed them here to July of 2018 for easy comparison, and you can see that similar trajectory. You can also see here an increase in 2020 and 2021 and a steady decline over the last couple of years. And we estimate those slight decreases to continue over the current year and the following year, with a 2.3% decrease and a 1.4% decrease in year 2. Tennessee Cash is another jackpot-based games, and one thing that we would like to point out here is that we are seeing lower lows with this game. We did have a significant jackpot cycle last fiscal year, with the highest jackpot almost doubling that of the year before, and as a result, we experienced growth of just under 8%. We are not estimating a similar cycle during our forecasting period. We're up 3.5% in the first quarter, but we're estimating a 4.9% decrease for the year, with an additional 1.6% decrease in year 2. Lotto America is another jackpot-based game that has seen a historic jackpot level last year, and this was combined with a game change where an additional drawing was added in July of last year. The jackpot last year exceeded 40 million, which is about 2.5 times as high as the high it's seen in the previous year. As a result, our sales more than doubled, adding 5.4 million. We have now retreated to relatively typical levels, with the Q1 decrease of 34%, with the potential of slight additional sales due to that additional weekly drawing. We estimate our sales for the 2-year period slightly higher than 2 years ago, but significantly lower than last year. Keno To Go has been consistent and steady on its downward path over the last couple of years, with a decrease of 6.3% last year and a 4.1% decrease in Q1 of this year. And we see no reason to deviate from that trend, and we estimate continued decreases in both years. Cash for Life was on a steady downward path until mid-2019, when we experienced an unexpected increase in sales that remained through 2020. Since then, we have resumed a similar downward trend. We are down by over 12% in Q1 of this year. For the year, we anticipate sales of 10.4 million, down 8.6% for the full year, followed by another decrease of 6% in year 2. And finally, Daily Tennessee Jackpot is a new game that was introduced in November of 2022. Partial year sales totaled just under 6.5 million. And typical with new games, we have seen an initial high interest followed by a decline shortly after. For the first part of this calendar year, weekly sales were generally between 150 and 200,000, with a bit more volatility in recent months. And our estimate for the current fiscal year is 9 million, which averages to about 173,000 per week. And we're estimating a slight decline in year 2. And so to our proceeds, this table summarizes our low, median, and high estimates across all games, as well as expenses for the current fiscal year. We're estimating an increase in net revenue of just under 19.5 million, driven by anticipated growth in instant games and Powerball. Expenses are estimated to increase by approximately 16 million, resulting in proceeds of just over 500 million, or a growth of 0.65%. In fiscal year 24-25, we expect to see continued growth in instant games, but a general decrease across all other games. As a result, proceeds are estimated to retreat to last year's levels at just over 497 million, or a decrease of about 0.7% relative to the current year. Growth in subsequent years is very difficult to forecast due to a number of unknown factors, such as changes to our game structures, varying jackpot cycles, and addition and discontinuation of games. We've taken a position of assuming growth of 2.5% across the board in the longer term, with proceeds reaching 535 million by year 5 of our forecast. And finally, this graph shows net lottery proceeds and our estimates over the 5-year period in orange. As you can see, we are generally assuming a pullback to and a subsequent minimal deviation from the longer term trend. That concludes our presentations, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that very thorough and I think very interesting presentation. Members, any comments or questions? Treasurer had to leave for today, but Commissioner, Secretary, any questions or thoughts? Thank you all very much for both your presentations. Thank you for being here. Next up in the cycle for lottery revenue estimating presentations, we have the Tennessee State Lottery Corporation. Ms. Rebecca Hargrove and Mr. Andy Davis, come on down, and you all are recognized.
Thank you. Well, we are about to embark on our 20th anniversary. Tickets went on sale January 20th of 2004. So we are just under 20 years of being in business. So since inception, we have surpassed 28.9 billion in total sales, with 80% of that coming from our instant ticket games. So instant ticket revenues were nearly 23.1 billion, and all of the other revenue, 5.8 billion, or 20%, came from all of the other games you just heard about. We've raised over 7.1 billion for the education programs that we fund, representing 6.87 billion for scholarships and grants, 269 million for after-school programs. For the 10-year period ending this past June, total gross revenues have increased on an average of 4.4% annually. Since our first full fiscal year in 2005, our instant ticket growth has averaged 6% annually. And for the 10-year period ending June 30th, the Lottery for Education proceeds funding averaged 4.5% growth. This past fiscal year set records for both total gross ticket revenues and total education funding. Our total gross ticket revenues were 2.1 billion, exceeding the prior record of 2.08. Instant ticket revenues were 1.684 billion, again representing over 80% of our total revenues. And we introduced for the first time a $50 price point game, which generated 102 million in instant game revenues. Our draw style revenues were 417.4 million, representing 19.9% of total, an increase of 80.9 million over the prior year. The increase was driven primarily by two $1 billion Mega Millions jackpots and a $2 billion Powerball jackpot, plus the addition of the third weekly drawing for Powerball. And in addition to a new feature tied to Powerball, which was called Double Play. Now, if you look at the 8 to 10 lotteries that started doing Double Play with the third drawing, the 10 of us had a much higher rate of return for that game than did the rest of the 48 states that sell that product. Fiscal year highlights this year, total ticket revenues are 698.1 million through October 28th. Instant ticket revenues of 528.8 million and draw style revenues of 169 million. So our fiscal year first quarter had the highest total revenues of 535 million and draw style revenues of 126 million, with total proceeds of 135.5 million. Now, if you look at some of the information you just saw, I will tell you that on average, our instant ticket sales over our first 18 years averaged 5.6% growth. Last year was flat, and this year is close to flat. And we attribute that to the introduction of sports wagering. Andy?
Thank you, Rebecca. I would just go through the highlights of the report that we provided to you. In terms of the first information we have is our gross ticket revenues, as Rebecca mentioned, through September 30th. We have not closed October yet, so that's through our first quarter. Total sales of 535.9 million, up 30 million over the prior year. As Rebecca mentioned, instant ticket games are the driving force for a significant portion of those sales. We have our Tennessee draw style games, Cash 3, Cash 4, Tennessee Jackpot, Tennessee Cash, and Keno to Go. And then our multi-jurisdictional draw style games, Powerball, Mega Millions, Lotto America, and Cash for Life. Instant tickets has represented approximately 80% of our estimated revenues this fiscal year. We're estimating instant tickets to generate between $1,714 million to $1,734 million for this fiscal year. We will be launching approximately 55 games this year, from price points of $1 to a $50 price point, as Rebecca mentioned, with the $5, $10, $20, and $50 currently generating the highest percentage of our sales in our instant ticket categories. Revenue drivers include, but are not limited to, our game design, obviously player preferences, the prize payouts associated with those games, our product marketing, and our optimizing our availability of those games in our retail network of over 5,000 retailers. The prize payout for our instant games is projected at 68.4% this fiscal year. And as I mentioned earlier, those games are going to generate the larger portion of our net lottery proceeds. On drawing style games, we're estimated in the range of $373 to $382 million for this fiscal year. Powerball is expected to generate 37% of the drawing style game sales, with Mega Millions representing 26% of those drawing style games. Primary drivers, as you heard earlier, is the jackpots for those two games. This year we have included two $1 billion plus Powerball jackpots, one in July and one in October. And we estimate Powerball sales for this fiscal year to be 120 to 123 million for fiscal year 2024. We've also benefited from a $1 billion plus Mega Millions jackpot that happened in August, and the estimated revenues for Powerball, for the Mega Millions game, is going to be a range of 68 to 71 million for this fiscal year for the Mega Millions game. In terms of our Cash 3 and Cash 4, they are a larger contributor to our draw style games. Combined, we are projecting revenues for these two games in the range of 128 to 132 million for fiscal year 2024. The remaining drawing style games, revenue estimate for 24 are Tennessee Cash, approximately 13 million, Keno to Go, 11 million, Daily Tennessee Jackpot, 7 million, Lotto America, 10 million, and Cash for Life, 11 million. When we look at our budget for this fiscal year, 2024, the direct expenses, which are the three major categories impacted by our gross revenues, prize awards will be our largest line item, budgeted at $1,259 million. Our instant game payout as a percentage of total lottery proceeds at 68.4 million. Our range of those based off of the price point is ranged between 53% or 72% of total lottery proceeds for prize payouts on instant games. Drawing style games as a percentage of sales is 50.3% of total lottery proceeds. Retail commissions are at 6.5% according to statute, budgeted at $136.2 million. And our major gaming vendor fees, which are our fees paid to our systems and terminal vendor, which is IGT, and to Scientific Games, who is our instant game printing and distribution major vendor, budgeted at $37.1 million or 1.8% of gross revenues. Our non-direct expenses are $37.1 million, which is 1.8% of gross revenues. That includes advertising at $8.1 million, non-direct gaming, which is $6 million, and then our general administrative at $23 million budgeted for this fiscal year. In terms of our estimation of net lottery proceeds, we're projecting this year between $480.4 million to $488.5 million for fiscal year 2024. And then after school program proceeds at the $18 million, which is capped by statute. When we look at a summary and recap of our fiscal year 2024 ranges, gross ticket revenue estimates at $2,087 million to $2,117 million. Total lottery proceeds, net of free tickets and including other income, range of $1,950 million to $1,978 million. And then our education funding As I mentioned, the net lottery proceeds estimate of 480.4 to 488.5 for fiscal year 2024. For projections going forward in the next years, we've conservatively estimated a 2% growth for fiscal year 2025 and further out years. So the fiscal year 2025 range would be 489 to 499 million in net lottery proceeds. So that's a summary of the report that we provided, and we'll take any questions. And I apologize for the voice.
Thank you very much. While we're in the spirit of apology, let me apologize. My force of habit led me to introduce our director, Rebecca Paul. We're glad to have you, and I will point out you're currently president of the World Lottery Association, which is an honor for us in Tennessee. We've come a long way in 20 years. In the 20 years that we have operated, have we had year-over-year growth?
Every year but one, I believe, and that was around 2016. We had our first $1 billion jackpot, which had a huge impact on sales, and the next year we didn't match that $1 billion jackpot. Now we've had year-over-year growth on our instant ticket product, which is the one we have the most control over, at I believe about 5.6%. So all of our other products have grown, but when you have an abnormal high jackpot, it's tough to reach that again the second year, even though it's a small percent of our sales.
Very good. Very interesting. Members, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Davis, did you say we currently have a game, instant game, that has a $50 price point?
That's correct.
When someone comes into a convenience store and buys a $50 ticket, how many do they typically buy? Do we know?
I do not know. Sorry.
I'm curious, if somebody walk in and buy one, do they buy more than one? I mean,
But remember, we still have to buy all of our products with paper or coin currency. So if they come in, they have to pay cash.
I'm curious if somebody.
Yeah, no, I don't know that we've ever looked at it, but I will and get back. I mean, I don't know how we track that because they're individual transactions that are done anonymously, which is why I pointed out it's paper and coin currency. We have no ability to track individual purchases. But let me look and see if I can find something out and get back to you.
Probably have some data about where those tickets are sold.
Yeah.
And so we would be able to go back to the owner of that establishment and ask, maybe get some anecdotal information, frankly. If does somebody come in and plop down $100 and buy two? Do they come in and throw down $500 and buy 10? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Well, oftentimes our top 10 retailers are in Ardmore, Fayetteville, Lincoln, and folks who are driving up will come in and buy $300 worth at a time and then take them back and possibly sell them to a friend or a family or whatever.
They pull their money and.
Yeah, so on the border, you have them buy whole packs of tickets at a time. But outside of the border, I don't think we have much evidence of that. But we do have that all along that border.
I'll check it tomorrow. I'm going to stop and ask that question. I just will stop and just watch it, watch what people purchase.
It's interesting. Let me see what I can track down and I'll get back to you.
In just a few minutes, we're going to have the much anticipated first presentation ever from the Tennessee Sports Wagering Council. But in that you're first, and in that I have recently had the opportunity to hear you speak somewhere else, talk about the, I think, very interesting dichotomy between your customer and the sports gaming customer, the age range and things like that.
Well, I don't know the age range of the sports betting customer. My gut instinct would be that it's a younger customer than ours, but I have not seen any of their data, so I don't really know. Our player tends to skew a little bit older. People don't start buying lottery tickets till they're about 30 in general. You may have a handful of players under 30. But most of our players are over 30.
Very good. Any other questions? If not, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Up next today, we have a presentation from TSAC. Again, on the same or similar subject. Tim Phelps, come on down. You are recognized.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members. Tim Phelps, Senior Director for Grants and Scholarships with TSAC. My remarks will be very brief. You should have a copy of our latest memo that provides the estimated expenditures for our lottery-funded programs. We have provided a baseline estimate for the current year through the 27-28 academic year. That current year estimate is based on student enrollment data. Typically, we look at the certification information that the institutions provide to us, but we had to take a little bit of a detour this year since this meeting falls a little bit earlier. But we still use for the out years a methodology where out year estimates are based on a growth in the number of potential recipients, their take-up rate, and the scholarship renewal rates. The low end of that range is going to represent a lower take-up rate and a lower renewal rate, and the high end of that range is going to represent a higher take-up rate and a higher renewal rate. And like I said, my remarks are brief and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Members, any questions?
I think the lame off.
Yeah.
All right, Commissioner Bryson.
Just so we don't let you off too easy on this, but this is an easy question. What is the Hope Scholarship now? What's the amount?
So for at a student at a four-year institution, the first year, the freshman and sophomore award amounts are $4,500. Junior and senior award amounts are $5,700. Those are the base. For a student at a community college, it's $3,200.
Okay, thank you. And those are set by statute, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
All right, members, thank you very much. We're now going to transition to what I just referenced, our first ever presentation from the Tennessee Sports Wagering Council. I'll note we have with us in the room 2 alumna from the Comptroller's Office, 1 alumna from the Secretary of State's office. Welcome. Yes. It normally takes me longer to eat. That's 2 hours.
Okay, 2 hours sounds good.
Just. Thank you very much. Mary Beth Thomas, Executive Director of the Tennessee Sports Wagering Council. And Mary Beth, I'll ask you to introduce those who are with you. You're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. Mary Beth Thomas, Executive Director. And I have to my left, Alexander Warnes, Chief Financial Officer, and to my right, Stephanie Maxwell, our General Counsel. And thank you very much for having us today. And I realize we're late in the day. I have about a 10-minute presentation, and I'll try to move through it because you probably have several questions. I wanted to start with a short overview of sports wagering, although Comptroller Mumpower may be able to give you an overview since he has just had his office spend quite a bit of time doing an audit of our office, but I will go through it anyway. So sports wagering was legalized by the General Assembly in 2019, and as you probably know, was initially regulated by the lottery. In 2021, the legislature created a standalone agency, which is our agency, and we assumed regulatory authority in January of 22. So through the combined efforts of first the lottery and then our office, we now have 13 online sports books that are doing business in Tennessee. At the end of September, the sports books have taken in close to $10 billion in wagers. So our council is responsible for regulating both online sports wagering and fantasy sports in Tennessee, and our work is really twofold. Or I told Stephanie she could be in charge of the clicker today. So first we vet and license sports books and fantasy sports operators, which is an annual process. And we also register vendors, which are companies that provide important services to our sports books, like geolocation services and know your customer technology services and things like that. So after we license these entities every year, we have the task of compliance work, which we do through our audit team, our investigators, and our legal team, and of course our IT experts, because we are regulating tech companies at this point. We have a staff of 18, including, as I said, lawyers, accountants, investigators, technology experts, and we've had a pretty amazing 2 years building our team and our regulatory program. It's been an amazing opportunity for all of us. So when Comptroller Mumpower asked us to attend this meeting, my first thought on how to put together some sort of estimate for you all was to think, okay, can we look at other states and see what's happening across the country? So I started to do that, and this first slide shows you sports betting throughout the country. You will see that 35 states plus DC have some sort of legalized sports betting. Now, nobody really has legalized sports betting until 2018. There was a federal law that prohibited states from having sports betting outside of Nevada and a couple of other areas. In 2018, that was repealed, and it really just took off across the country. So our state, as you know, was 2019 when we first enacted it. So our next slide shows you the mobile sports betting. 25 states plus DC have some form of mobile sports betting. Our state is unique in that we have only mobile sports betting. Wyoming is the only other state that has mobile sports betting, and Wyoming really is not a comparable state to ours. You know, we have 10 times the population. We have the Preds, the Titans. We have great collegiate teams, and Wyoming really has the Wyoming Cowboys, University of Wyoming. So, you know, we can't really be compared to them. And if we look at other states to try to understand how their taxes are collected and generated, we also run into trouble because the structure is so vastly different. Some states even have state-run sports books where they share equally in the profits. Some states require you to go in person to a casino to place a wager at a sports book. Some states have a really low tax rate and unlimited write-offs for promotional activity, and other states like New York have a 51% tax rate on revenue. So all of these factors really give a very different outcome to all the states, and it's so new, we decided not to focus on other states. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we got to that point. So that's why we're not looking at trends elsewhere. So I thought that it might be helpful to tell you about what has transpired since we went live in 2020. And our first slide here shows you the number of licensed sports books in the state. So the first year of operation, the first sports books went live in November of 2020. 4 went live at that time. And at the end of 2021 fiscal year, there were 7. By the next year end, there were 12. And in 2022, 23, we gained and lost 3. And this year we have 13, but we know that 1 is winding down its operations. As you might have seen in the news, WIN is pulling out of several states. So I say that to say, I believe that we are going to hold at around 12 sports books for the near future. So none of these sports books would be here if we didn't have people playing in Tennessee. And I wanted to just show you a little bit of the inside baseball here, so to speak. So we have a lot of technology in our office at our fingertips that we can use in our regulatory function. And one of the things that we utilize on a daily basis is a geolocation software that allows us to see wagering activity across the state. And we use that for a compliance function, basically to make sure that, wagers are being placed inside of our state, and also to do some tracking of wagering activity to make sure that there's not proxy betting going on or suspicious activity. So this is just a snapshot of 1 second in time, and these pinpoints show you data of devices being used at 1 second, either accessing a sportsbook app or, funding an account or any kind of interaction with the sportsbook when geolocation would take place of the bettor. And using that geolocation software, we were able to gather data on how many accounts have been created year to year, new accounts since 2021. And now these are calendar years, and we don't have data as far back as 2020. But I can tell you for 2021, we start out with around 443,000 new player accounts. In 2022, there were 656 around 100,000 player accounts formed. And if you take 2023, where we are at the end of October when we pulled this data, annualized, we think that there will be around 787,000 total, and that puts us at about the 2 million mark overall, and shows an increase last year, 20% new accounts, prior to that, 48%. So all of that helps us understand sort of how many people are playing and what options they have. But I think the important thing that we need to look at next as we move into looking at our revenue is understanding the total wagering amount that we have seen in the state. So our office is responsible for collecting privilege taxes from the sports books every month. We do that, not the Department of Revenue. And in doing that, we receive a lot of wagering data on a daily basis. And that's used not only, it's important for our office to collect it because we need to be able to have access to all of that data for other purposes on a compliance standpoint to root out any kind of fraudulent behavior. So if you look at this slide, it shows you the total wagers taken in by sports books without subtracting for any winning payouts. So this is just all of the money that's come in as a wager. And for the first fiscal year of operations, it's a little bit over 1.4 billion. And that jumps then to around 3.5 billion in 21, 22. The next year sees an increase to 4 billion, and we estimate around an 8% increase to 4.3 billion for this year as a whole, 23-24. If you look at the first quarter of our data, which this chart does not show you, but year over year, we're actually a higher number than that, but we've decided to use a conservative estimate of 5% for all months that we don't know, both for the rest of this year and the following 2 years. So I also want to say that while we do have complete wagering data for the first quarter, it's not wise for us to just multiply that by 4 to get to the whole year because of the fact that the gambling calendar has its ups and downs throughout the year. And so I wanted to show you a little bit about how that looks. So this takes our gross handle, again, those total wagers, and breaks it out by month across fiscal year. And so you can see the bottom line is the first year of operations. The yellow line is in 21, 22, and so on and so forth. And what's important here is that you can track sort of the rhythm of the sports calendar with college football, NFL, and then, you get up there in the NBA and NHL, and then March Madness brings another spike with dips in February before that, and then the summer months are down. So taking that historical data that we have, looking at that in Tennessee, we also wanted, as we tried to think about what the handle would look like moving forward, to look at what's happening outside of our state right around us, because there are a couple of important things I think y'all need to know. So you guys saw the geolocation technology I showed you a minute ago, and we see when we look at those maps that there have been in the past quite a few people who travel down from Kentucky right below the border to place wagers, which is legal. It's fine as long as you're in the state. and North Carolina, and we do see traffic from Georgia also. Kentucky just legalized sports betting last month, and although it's a very small sample, we're already seeing a decrease along that border of activity. And North Carolina, it has a casino sports book available, but it has legalized mobile sports betting. It just hasn't gone live yet. So we expect that to happen at the beginning of 2024 and think that that will pull away some of that border customer usage too. In Georgia, we know we'll probably have a big push next year for legalizing sports betting. So we think all of that leads us to this conservative growth estimate altogether of 5% moving forward. So we have talked a lot about total wagers, but I know that privilege tax is really what we're focusing on here. And it might be helpful for me to first explain to you all how our privilege tax is calculated, because the methodology changed this past July. Last legislative session, the legislature adopted a privilege tax on handle of 1.85%. So basically a gross receipts tax on handle. And as I told you, we collect this monthly. So prior to that time, Tennessee taxed net gaming revenue, meaning the total wagers taken in less payouts. A 20% tax was placed on this. And under the prior law, Tennessee also had a unique rule in place that required sports books to generate 10% net gaming revenue. So they had to have a hold of 10%. And mathematically, if a sports book took in $100, they could only pay out $90, and they had to have a 10% hold or a 10% net gaming revenue. We were the only state in the country to have this hold. And if a sportsbook did not meet that hold requirement, it was subject to a $25,000 fine, or it could be suspended. And I mean, frankly, the $25,000 fine is not really a big deterrent when you're talking about a lot of money. The hold requirement was really the topic of a lot of discussion for the first 2 years. And the industry said that the 10% was widely out of the margins that had been seen in sports betting and expected. And that the industry also said that it encouraged less favorable odds and bet types for players. And the accounting data that we received for the first 2 years supported this notion. And in fact, in both the calendar years of 21 and 22, only one operator met that hold requirement. On the other hand, there were multiple operators that paid out more in winning wagers than they took in, meaning they had a negative revenue and therefore no taxable revenue. So after 2 years of this scenario, the legislature made a change to the tax structure to tax the handle rather than the revenue. By making this choice, the legislature created a streamlined and predictable privilege tax and removed the risk from the state. Now, just like a gross receipts tax, if a wager is placed, a tax is owed. On the other hand, under the prior method, if a wager was placed and the player won, the state received nothing, only losing bets generated taxes. This policy decision changed the tax structure to ensure that Tennesseans will always receive privilege tax revenue regardless of how much revenue the sportsbook makes. And on the business side of things, the sportsbook is able to run their business the way they would like to and set their odds the way they would like to. It's been in operation for 4 months now, and from our end, it's certainly a much cleaner and it is a much more efficient process, and we are not constantly checking the deductions and consistency amongst all the operators. So anyway, turning back to our sheet, our slide, if you look at 2020, the total privilege tax, well, you all can read 24.5 million, 21-22, 46.3 million. My eyes are so bad now. And in this past year that just closed, 82.1 million. And our estimates for the following years are set forth in the slide as well, 78.9 8 million next year, and 82 the year after, and 86 the year after that, 86.5. So 80% of this privilege tax goes to the Lottery for Education account, 15% goes to the general fund for counties and local governments, and 5% to the Department of Mental Health for responsible gaming initiatives and programs. So again, we've used a very conservative growth rate, and nonetheless, we do see a slight dip this next fiscal year, but an upward growth rate in the next 2 years after that. And the one thing I would like to note here too is, just so that you guys know, our office does not use any of this privilege tax money for operations. Our office funding is from licensure fees, so we don't take any of that money.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. What about the question that I asked Director Paul? How do you see your player base versus the lottery player base? Do you, or maybe it's not versus? I think they're two very different products.
I would agree with that. I think I think that sports betting is even though it definitely has some chance involved, it involves more skill than instant games or lottery games, which are pure games of chance. From studies we've seen, we looked at this a while ago, our demographic is mostly male, age 24 to 35. A lot of professional college graduates. Those are the studies that we have seen, and I did not bring that with me, so if I've misstated anything, you'll have to forgive me. But it is something that we see Tennesseans engaging in to serve as sort of a part of their enjoyment of watching sports, and a lot of them make it something that's a part of their interest in sports, which I think is different.
So you would say your primary customer or user is more of a serious-minded, focused, consistent, regular player, gambler, as opposed to just more, I'm going to try this out, one-off users.
Yes, I would say that, yes.
Interesting. Members, any other questions? Ms. Secretary?
I've got one question with 17 parts. Thank you, Ms. Thomas. I appreciate the presentation. Did you say there are approximately 2 million accounts? Okay.
Yes.
Do we have any data on how many unique users there are? Because I assume somebody could have a FanDuel account, a DraftKings account, what is it, Action, or something like that. Do we have any data on that? How many people are?
These actually are, if you go back to this geolocation website, platform, these actually are device-based. So it should eliminate duplication across the sports books. And the reason for that is, if you look at, the white, and I can't remember, one is white, I believe, is an Apple device, green is an Android, and blue is a laptop. So this could be, now there could be crossover between people who are on their laptop and on their iPhone, but most people are betting on their phones. But this takes into account device tracking and not username, because, you're exactly right. I could collect every username from every sports book, and there could be an MB Thomas, a Mary Beth Thomas, a Mary Thomas, and it's all me. So this is 2 million unique devices.
Okay. So in theory, though, if somebody could have 12 accounts, you can divide that 2 million by 12, then you can really have a lot less users than you would think you have. Is that right?
No, I'm saying this is tracking my device across.
No, I understand what you're saying, but somebody can use that same device to have a FanDuel account and a DraftKings account, right?
Yes.
Okay. So my point there is, I think it's worth saying, there may be 2 million accounts out there, but not necessarily 2 million Tennesseans.
Well, this is showing 2 million.
Well, I'm not talking about what that's showing.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going back to, you have a slide that says new player accounts. It's 2021. Yeah, that one right there. I thought there you said that totaled up to roughly 2 million new accounts. So someone could have a DraftKings account and have a FanDuel account, right?
Well, what that should reflect is devices.
Okay.
2 million device accounts.
Okay.
So it should be based on device.
Okay. All right. Hey, the toll-free number that I hear get advertised, do you have any anecdotal information on that?
So, I do. I'll have to get it to you. The red line is the number that we're talking about. And then there's a national number, 1-800-GAMBLER. And they do track their data. And I would be glad to share that with you.
No hurry. I'm just kind of curious about that. Well,
that's why I don't have it handy.
One last question. Who is, I guess I'm going to ask by handle or revenue, whichever you want to give it to me. Who's the top 3 vendors in the state?
Well, and especially being your former general counsel, I don't think I've ever said this to you before, but I actually cannot share that information publicly because it is.
That's fair enough.
It is subject to a confidentiality provision.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Commissioner Bryson.
Thank you. I've got a little bit of a follow-up to that because I think it's really interesting. So what I heard you say is there's 2 million devices registered. Now, each device may have multiple accounts. There could be 12, there could be 8 million accounts. We don't know. But 2 million devices. And I think I heard you say earlier that they have to be in Tennessee. They have to be in Tennessee, correct? Yes. Is that geolocated or something? Is that how we do that? Okay.
Yes.
So what you're telling us is that 2 out of every 7 people in Tennessee are doing sports betting, because we've got 7 million people, right?
That's what our technology would show us.
Okay.
But to be fair, somebody could be logged in from a laptop and a phone at the same time. So they could be logged in their phone, never log out. They could be logged in a laptop, never logged out, and their desktop never logged out.
Okay, so 1.8 out of 7 million people. To be fair, they could. That's true, but it's probably a small number. So, okay, I just wanted to get a sense of, because my sense is this is growing really rapidly, and yet your numbers, your projections don't show rapid growth. And I was trying to kind of understand that a little bit. Maybe it's just my sense. I listen to sports talk, and everybody's advertising for you because they're all talking about it. Anyway.
Well, it's pretty startling, though, to think about that many Tennesseans.
That's right.
A device that's connected to one of these vendors.
And for the record, for those listening in particular, there are no physical locations, no parlors at our sporting arenas or anywhere else that this is conducted. It's all mobile device conducted.
That's exactly right. And if anybody sees one, they go to us.
But now that you bring that up, Comptroller, I mean, are you hearing of any potential legislation from those, either in the legislature or those in the industry, who are going to at some point pursue physical locations? Like I was in D.C. Last year, walked past a Washington Capitals game at Capitol Arena, and there's a huge stand outside where people are standing in line to place their bets.
I have not heard anything about that. And in fact, I mean, frankly, it's more accessible when it's mobile than it is in person.
Thank you, Comptroller.
Very good. No further questions. Thank you all very much. You can start planning for your presentation next year. We'll be inviting you back. It's very, very interesting and very, very important. Thank you. Members, one more item on our agenda today that concludes all of our presentations. This last item is simply an acknowledgement item. We have received a request to the board for consideration for program funding for the fiscal year 24-25 from net lottery proceeds pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated 451-111 C2B. You have a memo in your notebook under tab 7 from the Commissioner of Education requesting $23,000 from net lottery proceeds to support improvements and enhancements for educational programs and purposes as such net proceeds shall be used to supplement, not supplant, non-lottery educational resources for educational programs and purposes. The board is to acknowledge the request from the Department of Education. No other action is necessary. So unless there's any comments or questions, I'll deem this acknowledged. Thank you very much. That is the last item on our agenda today, and that we took item number 8 earlier while the treasurer was still able to be here. I thank you all for being here. I thank the funding board staff and everyone that participated in the audience today. We will reconvene this revenue estimating meeting on November 29th, 2023 at 2 p.m. in this same room to hopefully reach a revenue estimate for next fiscal year. And I will actually move that we recess to reconvene November 29th, 2023 at 2:00 p.m. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor of reconvening, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, like sign. See you on November 29th. Thank you.